Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto was about to die and met the Kyuubi part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. When people, responsible people that is, decide to have children, they swear that they will do all they can to protect their child. That no matter what they will always be there for them. To dry their tears when they cry, to hold them when they're cold, to pick them up when they first fall down, to watch with pride as they learn to do it for themselves. The first word, the first step, the first tantrum, the first piece of candy, when they truly want a child, parents swear in their deepest hearts to be there for it all. Namake's Minato, as he crouched over his newborn child, knew that with his last breath he would do something he had sworn to never do. He would break all of those promises one by one. A single tear trailing down his cheek displayed his inner turmoil to the world. As his old mentor and predecessor slowly approached him from behind, he brought his hands together to begin the sealing. "What are you doing here, Sarujuji?" he asked, panting slightly. "Are you sure you have to do this, Minato? You know very well that I could take your place," he asked over the sounds of the crying child. Minato's hands hesitated for a moment, tempted, never taking his eyes from the bundle of cloth and infant in front of him. Then his eyes hardened and the fourth Hokage of Konohagakure slammed his hands together to begin the fateful sequence of seals. "No. Sandaime-sama, when I took this hat from you I promised with everything that I am that I would protect this village with my life. This sacrifice will fulfill that vow." But the third cut himself off, realizing that he would do that same in the other man's place. Bowing his head slightly, he nodded, and then made to speak, but before he could, Minato instigated his last conversation. "Sarujuji." He swallowed harshly. "Kushina," he trailed off. "You already know the answer to that, Minato." Blinking furiously, his lips tightened harshly and then relaxed a tad, knowing that he'd soon be with his beloved redhead again. He then nodded and made one last request: take care of her, old man. "Who?" "My daughter. The one I will seal the Kyuubi no Kitsune into." Surprised, Sarutobi couldn't help but ask, "I thought you two were going to have a boy." Laughing harshly, as Minato's hands began to move, he replied, "We did too. I suppose it might be better this way in the end." Casting his gaze down to land on the now quiet child, he smiled slightly beneath the girl's solemn gaze. "I love you, my daughter, my legacy. No matter what you do in the uncertain future, you are the true hero tonight, Namake's Uzumaki Nariko. Make sure they know that too, old man." "Yes, I will." Minato made no indication that he had heard him as he finally completed the sealing. Staggering over to his now dead wife and silent child, with his last strength he gathered his still quiet baby in his arms and pressed one last blood-stained kiss to her forehead. He whispered it on his last breath to them both, "I love you." After a minute or so, the soon-to-be reinstated Sandaime Hokage, Sarutobi Hiruzen, moved forward to pick up the only living being besides him on the battlefield. Holding the girl gently, his eyes softened as he watched the baby begin to cry for a mother and father that would never answer her tears again. Gently running a few fingers through the tuft of blonde hair on her head, he patiently waited for the infant to calm down. Once she was reduced to mere sniffles, but was barely awake, he spoke. "You will have many hardships laying in front of you, my dear. I will do all I can to help you on your journey. But first," he sighed, turning to meet the many familiar chakra signals dashing towards him, "I suppose we must go back, Nariko." As he stepped into the room, he was immediately bombarded with questions and demands from the civilian half of the council. Half ignoring them, he made his way to the Hokage seat and sat down in the comfortable chair with relief. Adjusting the precious burden in his arms, he sighed and then turned his attention back to the people before him. Silence. Taking a deep breath in the sudden silence, he then continued, "Now then, shall we get down to the important business?" He directed the subtle barb in the direction of those who had been complaining the loudest. "We are currently without a leader. I take it that since no one has objected to me taking this seat," he glanced in Danzo's direction, "we are in agreement. I shall resume office as the third Hokage. A show of hands to make it official then, shall we? All four?" He was immediately answered with a unanimous positive response. All against? No one made any response to the question they all knew was a mere formality at this point. Then Danzo raised a hand for permission to speak. "Hokage-sama," he said without inflection, "why have you brought a child, what looks to be a newborn at that, to the council chamber?" The bandaged man had his suspicions, but wanted to be sure before voicing his request. The question, however, was mirrored in the faces of the other members of the council. Straight to the point as always, eh, Danzo? He thought before tilting his head to look down at the tuft of blonde hair and whiskered cheeks of the child in his arms. He then returned his attention to the expectant faces before him and spoke. This child, Uzumaki Nariko, the eyes of the few who knew the importance of that last name widened and continued to widen as he continued, is now the Jinchuuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune, and the true hero this night. Namake's Minato, our fourth Hokage, gave up his life to seal the monster into this child mere hours ago. The most important part of his speech was immediately ignored by the civilian part of the council as they all began to speak at once, eyes wide with shock and fear. As they blurted out their thoughts with no regard to the policies that had governed the council since its establishment, Sarutobi's eyebrow began to twitch as he started leaking killer intent. What? How? That thing is, that child can't. Why did you bring it dash? So the monster took the form. We must kill it. Immediately. At the last, particularly loud asterisk, comment Sarutobi stood to his full height and unleashed the full force of his personality on the clamoring idiots in front of him. Once again, silence. Glaring around the suddenly silent room, Sarutobi took a deep breath and continued where he had left off. This child, mere hours old, is not the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Glancing at the, at least till now, silent shinobi part of the council, he elaborated. Think of it as if Nariko is a sealing scroll and the Kyuubi a kunai. Even if the kunai is sealed into it, the scroll does not become the kunai at all. It's a vastly simplified explanation, but I'm sure you get the point. Nariko is Nariko, and the Kyuubi is the Kyuubi. Raising his hand into the silence, Danzo requested speech again. At Sarutobi's nod he began to speak. That much is obvious to anyone with anything beyond rudimentary SEAL training, which should be every shinobi here. At this he gave the relaxing clan heads and his fellow advisors a rather pointed glare, getting a few sheepish shrugs in return. However, you are wrong in saying that she is not a weapon. To be a Jinchuuriki is to be a weapon. Give her to me and I will train her to be stronger than even Tsunade could dream of being, he said, a greedy glint in his eye. No. She will grow up as normally as possible and enter the academy when she is deemed ready to learn the ninja arts. Minato expected that she would be treated as a hero, not as something less than human. We will follow his request to the letter. Looking around the room to gauge the reaction of the rest of the council, he saw acceptance in the faces and body language of the shinobi, except for the Aburame clan head, but that was to be expected, though the heads of the Hyuga and Uchiha clans, Hyuga Hayashi and Uchiha Fugaku respectively, both sported their typical unreadable and arrogant frowns. The civilians though, even as they attempted to keep their faces blank and neutral, their eyes and body posture betrayed their thoughts. Cold eyes glared at the bundle he still held in his arms, the way they held themselves betraying their disgust, horror, fear, hatred, and indifference. He made a split-second decision, as he frowned at the civilians. This will be an SS-class secret, punishable by death if spoken of. It may be revealed only by me and, when she gets older, Nariko herself, without punishment. This rule is now law. Any who are caught breaking it will be immediately executed. Raising his hand, at the third's nod, Hyuga Hayashi began to speak. If I may, Hokage-sama, I can see the red chakra of the Kyuubi in the seal on the girl's stomach. Any of my clan who have activated their bloodline will be able to do the same. May I have permission to tell them the truth should they ask about it? No. You will tell them that it is a special condition, you may even refer to it as a bloodline if it would help, that only Nariko has and that they, by order of the Hokage, are never to speak of it. This goes for all clans that are able to distinctly sense chakra. He looked pointedly at the Inuzuka, Aburame, and Uchiha clan heads. After closing his eyes for a moment he slowly sat back down. I will give you until tomorrow to organize your thoughts and the things we will need to go over as a group. You are dismissed. Sighing, he watched the members of the council remove themselves from his line of vision. He could only hope that this would help her as she grew up. Somehow he felt as if he had just made his greatest miscalculation. He quickly shook off the feeling. What? As he quailed beneath the furious gaze of the man before him, the masked Anbu could only think of how much he hated playing the messenger. Almost as soon as the council meeting was dissolved, one of the civilian members had immediately returned to his home and told his clan, as well as everyone he met along the way, the truth of how the Kyuubi was defeated. They had attempted to do as much damage control as possible, but it was impossible to stop the rumors from spreading. He knew that by the next morning everyone old enough to understand *** would know the truth of what had happened to the Kyuubi. However, only those of Chunin rank and above would be able to completely realize the difference between the Kyuubi and Nariko. standing from his position behind his desk and quickly moved toward the council room, the rather shell-shocked ANBU trailing behind. What have they done with the instigator? Snapping to attention, the man adjusted his sheep mask and replied, he was taken to Ibiki. Good. Giving a brief, menacing smirk, the Sandaime gave his orders. Once you have the identity of everyone, he told, execute him. Throwing open the doors of the council room, the god of shinobi left his subordinate to follow his orders. Collapsing into the unreasonably comfortable chair behind his old, new desk, Sarutobi Hiruzen gave a weary sigh as he looked around the room. It had been a mere 4 years since he had last sat here. Looking around the office, he realized that this room was no longer truly his. The way the paperwork was organized, the objects on the shelf a few feet away, the pictures on the desk, none of it was his. What brought it home the most was the unsmiling photograph of his predecessor on the wall across from him. With saddened eyes, he simply gazed at the serious picture of the fourth Hokage for a moment, remembering the meeting he had just escaped from. He sighed again and then spoke out loud, you would be so disappointed in this village, Minato. I know I am. But if I want to protect her as much as I can, I suppose this is all I can do. I am so sorry. Blinking, he shook his head at his reminiscing and stood turning to look out over the village and into the rising sun. After they took care of most of the problems that resulted from the disaster, it seemed almost inevitable that things would just go downhill from there. The civilians were almost completely against Naruto and nothing he could say seemed to change their minds. However, he knew that the rest of the council would be more subtle with their dealings. Naruto would have to have a guard almost 24/7. He almost wanted to scream at them that they were doing this to their ever-so-beloved hero's child, but knew that would make things even worse. After all, Minato had had many enemies, both outside and inside the village, that would take any chance to get back at him, even if he was now dead. It might even turn some of his shinobi against both him and the child, and that must be avoided at all costs. Since he couldn't reveal her heritage to the council without grave consequences, Naruto was considered a civilian and thus under the care of those that hated her most. He would have to send her to a public orphanage instead of keeping her with him as he had first intended. All of his students were out of the village at this point, so he couldn't even entrust her upbringing to one of them. Sighing, he turned back to his desk and picking up a pen began to get to work. I am so sorry. Uzumaki Naruto was a precocious child, and very intelligent too. She knew that she was different from the other children she saw around the village. Other children were coddled and held when they cried. She was ignored. Other children played without a care in the world. She had to worry about where her next meal would come from. The biggest difference that she sees, however, was in how differently they were treated by the people of the village. Other children were greeted with indulgent smiles and snuck free candy when parents weren't looking. Whenever a villager caught sight of her, the hairs on her neck stuck up and she couldn't help but flinch back from the cold glare that looked past her as if she didn't even exist. She hated it. So she smiled and laughed and hoped that if she acted like any other child her age that maybe they would see her. But Naruto was smart and almost 6 years old, and she knew she was different. He could only watch as the abomination that still defiled his home skipped merrily down the street, a smile on its face as it ignored the harsh glares of the surrounding populace. He ground his teeth together, glaring just as harshly himself. His entire family, aside from himself of course, had been killed when the Kyuubi had first broken through the wall of the village. He would forever worship the ground the fourth walked on, were he still alive, for stopping the monster and sealing it into such a vulnerable form so he would be able to take his own revenge on the beast. That the form it took mirrored the fourth's own coloring so closely merely rubbed salt in an already open wound. No matter though, the anniversary of the Kyuubi's defeat at the beginning of the next month would herald the first festival of such and would also provide the perfect opportunity to finish it off. Smirking evilly, he turned and disappeared down the alleyway. There were preparations to be made after all. Hanging out the window of the apartment that she had been given earlier that day by Sarutobi, Naruto grinned as she watched the fireworks light up the sky. Gigi had told her that it wasn't safe for her to leave the apartment today, and she believed him. Gigi was the smartest old person she knew after all. All the other ones couldn't do anything but glare. Except for Tsuchiji, of course. Ichiraku ramen is the best. Sighing, she pouted slightly. The fireworks were almost over and she was really curious about what a festival looked like. She had never been to one before, though Ayame had told her stories. Glancing down, she was taken slightly aback to see a person standing in front of her building. She thought that everyone would be at the festival by now. Except for her, of course. Staring slightly, her eyes widened in surprise as she watched more shadowy figures join the first. As they lit torches and moved towards her building in a steadily gathering mob, she backed away from the window and looked around frantically for an escape route or a place to hide. Finding nothing, she dashed into her room and dove under the bed, hoping beyond hope that they weren't there for her. Flinging open the door to the topmost apartment, the man turned and shouted down the hall to the rest of the mob, "Hey! I think I found it." "Are you sure, Yaji?" "Yeah, Kiro, so come on." Shaking under her bed, Nariko shoved herself as far up against the wall as she could. Eyes wide with unshed tears, she squeaked involuntarily in surprise as another pair of eyes suddenly glared into hers. A sick grin spread across the face of the man that had invaded her room. "Found you! Found you!" As he pulled the little monster out from under the bed, Yaji couldn't help but be disgusted with rather pathetic appearance it took. "Trying to play on our sympathies, eh? Well, it won't work, you monster." Pulling two kunai from inside his jacket, the other man gave a cruel smirk. "Can't have you running away on us now, can we, Kyuubi?" As Yaji pinned the small body to the ground, Kiro shoved the kunai through its palms. The rest of the mob began pouring through the apartment, trashing whatever they found and preparing to join in on the torture. The mob continued to attack her for next half an hour with anything they could find that might hurt her. Finally, they stepped back as the two that had crucified her on her bedroom floor came forward. "As enjoyable as all this is, we don't have much time left," said the one previously referred to as Kiro. Roughly tearing one of the kunai from her mangled arm, and only getting a choked-off whimper in response, the other continued, "So now you will die, demon." As the kunai rapidly descended to slash into the girl's unresponsive eye, Nariko woke up and was very surprised to find herself in a sore. She could have sworn she was about to die. As she sat up, the water reached her chest and she looked around in confusion. Strangely, the water didn't feel cold at all. She couldn't smell anything either. Looking around, the girl was surprised at how run down the walls looked, even if they were still standing strong. Glancing up, she was taken aback by the glowing pipes that snaked all over the ceiling. Suddenly noticing the glowing intersection a few yards away, she trotted towards it, her feet not making a sound in the still strangely still water. Pausing in the center of the bright fluorescent light, Nariko then chose a path at random, not knowing that in this place every way leads to the cage. Nariko, beyond bored by now, began humming a nursery rhyme one of her old Anbu guards had taught her under her breath as she continued to wander down the never-ending and never-changing hallways that stretched endlessly both in front of and behind her. Then she suddenly noticed a light in the distance. Wanting to escape her gloomy surroundings, she raced towards it as fast as she could and was surprised when she suddenly stumbled into yet another lighted intersection. Confused, she looked around and was then distracted by a hallway that, instead of disappearing into the darkness, was obscured by a light she couldn't see beyond. Warily walking forward, she squinted her eyes shut and then made to open them again as the glare died down. "I was not expecting this. Not yet anyway." Surprised by the unexpected voice, the girl looked around, trying to find the source of it. While low and unmistakably rumbling with power, the voice was somehow undeniably female as well. Still confused, the girl took a step back once she got a good look at her surroundings. In front of her stood an immense gate that she couldn't even see the top of, sealed by only a slim piece of paper with the kanji for seal scribbled on it. "Well? What are you just standing there for, girl? Come closer." The command in the voice was unmistakable. Instinctively obeying, the child slowly moved closer to gate, and was scared out of her wits by a sudden roar that sent her tumbling as over tea kettle to land in the space she had just moved from with a splash. Sitting bolt upright in the still chest-deep water, the little girl had an almost comic expression of pure terror on her face. As the voice burst into low-pitched laughter, she relaxed a bit, but then froze in terror all over again at the sight that greeted her from the shadows beyond the slowly lightening gate. Slowly stepping forward, an immense creature with unmistakable nine tails swishing and curling behind it met her gaze as its chuckles intensified once again. "Hey ha ha ha! You should have seen the look on your face. I have not had a laugh like that since, well, I actually cannot remember the last time I laughed like that." Regaining some of her composure, the girl, still slightly wide-eyed, stared in shock at what could only be the Kyuubi no Kitsune. "What?" she muttered, and then louder, "What the hell is going on?" Relax, Kitling. I have been here your entire life. You are the vessel of the Lord of all Kitsune. The nine-tailed Bijou. You are, and always have been, the Jinchuuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune. I am sure some things make a hell of a lot more sense now, don't they? Looking back on her life so far, especially the last hour or so of it, she couldn't help but agree. "Yeah," she said softly, sadly. "But why were you sealed in me?" I thought the Yondaime had killed you? She practically threw the questions at the massive creature. There were a few reasons behind it from what I can understand. The first is that it is impossible to kill a bijou. Even if you do manage to disperse our forms, we simply reappear somewhere else in the world, and I am the most powerful one. Your father knew that, so he sealed me inside of you at the cost of his own life. Wait a minute. My father? Are you saying that the Yondaime was my father? Do you know who my mother was as well? Looking down at the desperate face of the child in front of her, the Kyuubi's eyes softened almost imperceptibly, and she replied, Your mother was named Uzumaki Kushina before she married your father in secret. She was one of my Jinchuuriki. I have never been sealed in anything but an Uzumaki. Your father was, as you have guessed, Namake's Minato, the Yondaime Hokage of Konohagakure. When I was extracted during your birth, I was immediately put into a berserker state and forced to attack Konoha. Sighing, the giant fox sat back on her haunches and continued, Namake's had no choice but to seal me into you. No other child could have handled the strain. There was also the fact that as long as he had a choice, he could not ask someone else to sacrifice something he himself was not willing to give. I can respect that, which is the only reason I do not completely hate his guts for sealing me into a human. Again. Nodding in a sort of dumbstruck understanding, Nariko collapsed back into the water. Shocked anew by the sensation, she asked another question of the fox. By the way, where are we anyway? This is your mindscape. It is a reflection of your consciousness. Its state is a direct reflection of your mental health. Considering what it looks like, I am surprised you are not completely insane. Eyes wide, the blonde child took another look at her surroundings, shocked for a different reason this time at its state. Realizing that it was probably the fault of her treatment at the villager's hands, she suddenly remembered what exactly had been going on with her body in the outside world. Kyuubi, she hesitated for a minute before just blurting it out, Am I dead? No. If you were, you would not need to ask. However, you soon will be if we do not take some rather drastic measures. The fox said in a rather unconcerned tone. What? Why didn't you tell me that in the first place? We're just sitting here talking and I'm about to die. The girl screamed rather hysterically. Why? The girl then cut herself off and said in a rather irritated manner, Why aren't you panicking too? As she met the amused gaze of the rather massive creature behind the bars, she attempted to scowl, but it came out as a rather cute pout instead. Because we have some time to think about what we are going to do first. I would not panic too much if I were you. It is really not worth the effort. Why do you not try to change this place into something a little more comfortable while I change into a more convenient form? Not being able to do anything but stare after the massive figure that was retreating into the gloom beyond the cage for a few seconds, the girl then regained her composure and yelled after it. And just how am I supposed to do that? And then huffed and muttered under her breath, Stupid, lazy fox. I heard that. Jumping at suddenly being face to teeth with the being imprisoned inside of her, Nariko gave a sheepish smile. Heard what? Cocking her massive head, the fox snorted, making the girl fall back on her but in the uncomfortable water. Narrowing her eyes slightly in amusement at the impudent kit, the fox just made to turn back into the cage before replying. It is your mind, Kit, do what you want with it. As soon as the giant fox left her line of sight, the girl flopped back down into the water, sighing with relief. Now that she finally had time to relax, the events of the day came rushing back to her in a rush. Waking up on her birthday, meeting Jiji, getting some celebratory ramen from Ichiraku's, and then ignoring the looks that most of the villagers gave her as Sarujiji took her to her new apartment. Watching the fireworks by herself, and then she avoided thoughts about what had happened next. She really hoped that the fox had a good reason for being so blasé about all this, but she couldn't help but worry. Was she really about to die? She then thought about the revelations that had hit her one after the other, keeping her totally off balance. She couldn't help but wonder if that was the beast's intention with throwing all of that in her face. The Yondaime was her father? Who would have ever guessed? She could hardly believe it even now. Then she frowned again. Who could have guessed? She bet Jiji knew. He was the Hokage after all, how could he not have known? She was going to have a long talk with him when she got out of this mess. She'd think about the rest of it later. She then shook her head and turned to the original task set in front of her. So, I just have to want it enough then? She asked herself. She then frowned in concentration, closing her eyes and focusing on the most beautiful things she could think of. Snow and sakura petals drifting gently through the air came to mind. She then opened her eyes and gasped with delight. She now sat in an expansive field that she could just barely see the edges of. It spread out from around her in a far-reaching plain. At the farthest edges of her vision, she could just barely make out the towering dark forest surrounding it. Snow covered the ground in an even and untouched blanket without a single blemish. When she moved, she didn't even leave a trace where she'd been. Looking through the gently falling snow, she glanced up when a flash of the palest pink caught her eye. Towering above her was an immense sakura tree in full bloom. The branches spread out and up from the massive trunk, unhindered by gravity. She knew that even 10 of her wrapping her arms around the trunk wouldn't encircle it, and from where she was standing, she couldn't even make out the top of the tree. Collapsing into the soft snow, as she looked around in awe, she was surprised to notice that the snow was just as temperatureless as the water had been before. After an endless moment spent admiring her handiwork, she snapped out of her half-trance and moved to lean her back against the tree as she waited for the Kyuubi to return. After she had shifted to a mostly human form, the Kyuubi snorted and stretched. While this was one of her more favored forms, it always took a while to work the kinks out after a prolonged amount of time in her natural form. As the snow reached her and started falling, she materialized a blood-red yukata that complemented the reddish-orange of her fur and wrapped it around herself. Curling her only visible tail around her waist until it resembled a sash, she used it to secure the garment around her waist and side. Turning in the direction she instinctively knew was her vessel's main consciousness, she gave a slight smile at the sight of the massive sakura tree in full bloom. I suppose the next move is mine. I hope she will accept the offer, though. Everything rides on her answer at this point. She then gave another sigh and began a leisurely stroll towards the now sleeping form of Uzumaki Noriko. Noriko! Noriko, wake up! Waking up to the sound of someone calling her name, Noriko rubbed her eyes clear and yawned. Glancing around for whoever had called her, she was surprised at who she found kneeling next to her. She looked to be around 20 years old, had long reddish-orange hair that pooled around her waist where she sat next to her. She wore a blood-red yukata that was secured around her waist with a silky sash the same color as her hair. What really caught her attention, though, were the red eyes, with slit black pupils, and the small fox ears that poked cutely through the hair on the top of her head. Eyes wide with slight awe, she immediately guessed who this was. Kyuubi? Tilting her head with a slight smirk and an almost imperceptible twinkle of mischief in her eye, said Kitsune replied, "Yes, little one." "Is that really you?" "Yes, it is, Kit." Now then, the Kitsune's face smoothed seriously, the twinkle disappearing from her eye and the smirk from her mouth. "We need to discuss how we are going to survive the next few hours." The next few hours? What? I had almost forgotten I was dealing with someone who has just reached their 6th year. Eyebrow twitching in slight irritation at the interruption, the Kyuubi interrupted the young girl in turn. "Yes, the next few hours. Now, as I was saying, I have a proposition for you." Narrowing her eyes in suspicion, suddenly remembering just who, or what, it was she was conversing with, Noriko replied warily, "What kind of proposition?" Smiling slightly in approval of the suspicious nature of the child, the woman replied in a serious manner, "Will you become my heir, Noriko?" Meanwhile, mere minutes before the mob prepared to finish of Noriko, Sarutobi Hiruzen dashed from the Hokage Tower with a contingent of Anbu falling in behind. He was heading directly towards Noriko's last known location, the apartment building he had just given her for her birthday. "I can't believe this. How could the paperwork for Noriko's guard shift get so muddled? She's been alone and without a watcher for almost half an hour now. How could this have happened?" he thought frantically. He had his suspicions, though. The civilian council had been far too quiet lately. After managing to secure a few minor concessions from him almost a year ago, they hadn't voiced anything but the usual complaints that could be brushed off with impunity. While for once Danzo didn't seem to have his hands in it, that might be the only blessing here. If Noriko was hurt, he'd never be able to forgive himself. As he jumped from building to building towards Noriko's apartment, he could only hope that the sinking feeling he had in the pit of his stomach was unwarranted. Blinking slowly in shock, Noriko stared dumbly at the form the Kyuubi had taken. "Become your heir?" She slowly repeated what had just been said, the words not quite registering. Waiting patiently for the small girl to regain her composure, the Kyuubi nodded in confirmation. "Yes, Kit, my heir." Ever so slowly the girl tilted her head in slight confusion. "An heir is like a successor, right? Someone you bequeath everything to when you die, right?" Noriko said this rather blankly. "Yes," the Kitsune replied carefully, not quite sure where the child was going with this. "And you want me to be yours?" The girl's eyes had mostly cleared of their dumbfounded shock and stared straight at the fox, looking for any kind of deception in her eyes and movements. Yes. That was one thing the Kyuubi was now sure of. Why? Because we really, have no other choice, Nariko. The Kyuubi cast regretful eyes down to meet the human child's questioning gaze and then looked away, bringing her hand up to rest on the slim black collar that was wrapped around her neck and had somehow gone unnoticed until now. You are about to die and I am facing what could be the end of my existence as well. Nariko's eyes widened in surprise once again at this pronouncement. What do you mean by that? She asked tensely. The Kyuubi gave a sigh and began to explain, knowing that to hold back relevant information at this point would only hinder what she was trying to do. I mentioned it before, did I not? That I have had previous Jinchuuriki? Settling in for what promised to be a rather long story, Nariko nodded in confirmation. Yes. You said that my mother was one, she prodded. Yes, I did. But this starts a bit beyond that and directly involves the first leader of this rotten village. Ignoring the slur to the village, after tonight she could kind of understand that point of view, she had to question that last. You mean the show dame? Yes, of course, she absently confirmed. I had been summoned by Uchiha Madara and forced against my will to help him battle Senju Hashirama, your Shodai, at what would later come be known as the Valley of the End. It was a fierce battle, I'll admit that much, and one of the finest I had ever seen as fought by humans. In the end though Madara lost and ended up just barely managing to escape with his life. However, in order to do so he had to abandon me to the Senju's tender mercies. The Senju's wife was an Uzumaki Mito, and she was a master of sealing techniques. As the Senju subdued me with his Mokuton Jutsu, the woman sealed me into her own body. I will not explain the mechanics involved except that if Mito had died while I was sealed in her I would have simply been freed. Nariko relaxed back into the snow as the story continued, forgetting for a moment just who was telling the story and enjoying the first time someone had ever taken the time to tell her something about themselves. But the woman knew that as well, and so, almost 60 years later, when she realized she would soon die, she summoned her great niece, your mother, from Uzushigakure to become my next vessel. Kushina was no more than 5 or 6 years old at the time, I believe. The transfer was successful however, and a few weeks later, after they had confirmed there were no apparent problems, Kushina entered the Konoha Ninja Academy. It was there that she met your father for the first time. They had used the same seal on your mother that Mito had used on herself, it just was a bit more secure and not quite as rushed. As such the same rule applied, had she died I would have been free. Now as your mother and father grew up and eventually fell in love, she taught him a few of the Uzumaki sealing techniques. He used quite a few of the concepts involved to eventually develop the seal that binds the two of us. As the kitsune stopped to reflect on this, Nariko looked up at her eagerly, excited to be learning something about her parents. What happened next? She asked, hoping to get the fox to continue. Giving the young girl curled up next to her an amused look at the unsubtle prodding, the Kyuubi obliged, and so it eventually came to be that you were conceived. This was celebrated mightily by your mother and father, and the others that knew of your impending birth. However, it also brought up a few problems for them. A Jinchuuriki's seal is most unstable at 2 points of their life. During childbirth and just before death. I am sure you understand. Just after your mother had birthed you and had yet to recover, she and your father were interrupted. I am still not sure how, but that imbecile, Uchiha Madara, managed to survive the years from his defeat to then, but he did. Managing to temporarily distract your father by putting your life in danger, he then, while your father was ensuring your safety and your mother was too weak to fight him off, ripped open the seal and set me on Konoha. I must admit that I do not remember much after that. I vaguely remember fighting and crushing buildings and people beneath my paws, but that is about it. The next thing I knew, I was once again sealed, this time inside of you, and I have spent the last few years analyzing this seal. She finished tugging sharply on the collar again. I see, said Nariko, reflecting on all that the fox had said. But that doesn't explain why you're about to die too. This seal is easily one of the most complex I have ever seen, the Biju said in admiration. It has multiple functions, but there are only 2 that are very important right now. The first is that this seal forbids me from doing anything that may cause you harm, directly or indirectly, unless it is to save your life. The second binds our very souls together, making it so that when you die I too will cease to exist. However, there is a slight loophole, one your father either overlooked or never thought I would be desperate enough to use. I can give you my power. You would become a kitsune, probably the most powerful to ever exist. You would live for thousands of years and take up my position as the most powerful of the Biju when in this dimension. The vixen then took a deep breath and repeated the question she had asked earlier. Will you become my heir, Nariko? The girl was more than slightly overwhelmed by the weight of what the fox was asking, but if there was one thing she had learned from her life so far, it was that there was always a catch. So, what's the catch then, Kyuubi? Smart girl, you will not get all of this at once, and even then it won't necessarily be my power you are absorbing. While I do have nearly infinite stores of chakra, that will not be what I am giving you. In order to inherit what I am, I will, one by one, when I think you're ready, be giving you my tails. Your tails? Asked the girl, confused. Yes, my tails. My tails are what make me what I am. They represent what I am, as a kitsune and as a bijou. You will have to gain your own experience with them and master them yourself though. However, when the time comes for you to absorb my final tail, you will have 10 of them. 10? But you only have 9, right? Yes, but you eventually will develop the 10th and ultimate tail from your own, what used to be human, chakra. But you will have to work very hard to earn this. I will not hand my tails over to a weakling. I will only transfer them to you when I deem your body and mind ready to handle the strain, and even then it will hurt more than you can imagine. The Kyuubi then closed her eyes, asked for the last time, will you, Namikaze Uzumaki Nariko, become the heir of all that I am? The girl thought about it for a moment, weighing all the pros and cons she could really understand, and then gave a firm nod, resolve shining in her clear blue eyes. Yes. I will. As the Sandaime reached the apartment complex, all he could do was watch in shock and awe as it was engulfed in a towering pillar of flame. The heat was so intense, he could feel it giving him light burns from where he stood on top of the next building. He jumped down to land in the street before the building, his ANBU guard following closely. Staring at the roaring flames, he was almost ready to mourn the loss of his favorite blonde when he detected a slight movement within the fire. It slowly resolved itself into a small figure dragging a larger one behind as it calmly walked out of the collapsing building. It then took a few staggered steps towards Sarutobi and he raced to catch it as it tripped over a loose stone. Supporting what could only be the girl child that he had been so worried about against himself, he stood again, scooping the child into a bridal-style carry against his chest. Seeing that she was still just barely conscious, he tilted his head downwards to hear what she was trying to say. Sorry about the apartment, Sarujiji. Shaking his head in amusement at what the girl had said, his eyes then widened at the amount of damage there seemed to be to her body. What has happened to you? Getting no answer from the now completely unconscious child, he turned briefly to order his subordinates to take care of the cleanup and then rushed in the direction of the Konoha General Hospital. As he looked through the two-way mirror at the young girl lying lifelessly on a hospital bed, clad only in a hospital gown and bandages and blankets, Sarutobi could only think of broken promises and broken trust and the fire that still enveloped the apartment building on the other side of town. And he knew that, once again, he had failed. As she opened her eye, the girl took a deep breath and then immediately let it out with a soft whoosh of air. Closing her eye again, she tried to remember what she had been doing that would land her in a hospital. Suddenly she noticed that she hadn't been able to open her left eye. Blindly raising her hand to feel what could be obstructing it, she was startled to feel her fingers meet the unmistakable cloth of bandages. The blade of a kunai slashing across her eye. Now remembering the attack, she raised her hands to her face and stared in a sort of entranced horror at the jagged scars etched deeply into the palms. The weight of a grown man's body pinning her to the ground as something sharp and pointy that hurt and hurt and hurt, drove through small hands, pinning them to the floor, hands that dropped back to her sides as everything else that had happened on that endless night raced through her head. One small hand made its way to rest on her stomach, clutching at the place she now knew a seal was forever etched as memories flashed behind her eyelids. Giant red eyes behind bars that reached up for forever and ever. Jinchuuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune, Sakura and Snow, a slim black collar around a deceptively delicate throat. Will you become my heir, Namikaze Uzumaki Nariko? She passed out. I will. So how do we do this, Kyuubi-san? Asked the girl, staring unwaveringly into the unnerving red eyes of the Kitsune. You accepting the offer of your own free will has already started the process, replied the Kyuubi. You have already started to become a daughter, of sorts, to me. Right now your body is in no condition for me to transfer even my first tail to you. But our agreement cemented a sort of contract between us and it has already begun to affect the seal, see? With a few delicate fingers she directed the girl's attention back to the slim collar around her neck. The girl stared for a few moments before she detected any clear changes. She suddenly realized that the choker was not just a slim band of black fabric but a solid band of numerous overlapping symbols that could only be seals. The only reason she noticed this was because the seals themselves were shifting and changing and the odd seal would occasionally glow red and shift to an entirely different symbol. The vixen gave a slight smile at the look of awe on the child's face before she continued with her explanation. I will explain the particulars of the seal and the contract to you when we have more time. Right now what you must do is allow me to temporarily channel my consciousness and power through you so I may remotely assist you when you wake. What exactly does that mean? Asked Naruto. While the girl was far more intelligent than most children her age, she still got a bit lost when adults started in on the high-level vocabulary. What it means is that, while you are in a kind of danger that I know you are incapable of getting out of alive yourself, we can temporarily kind of merge. Holding up a hand to forestall any protests, the fox continued to explain. You will still be mostly in control, but you will be affected by my chakra and power. It will not allow me to take complete control of your body, but it will allow me to control some of your movements when you fight to stop you from getting yourself killed. This will let me help you obliterate all the mentally deficient imbeciles that thought it was a good idea to attack my vessel. Do you understand? Clamming down a little after the explanation, the girl thought about it for a while and then agreed. Now, I must warn you that, because you are not used to so much power flowing through you, you will immediately pass out once you are safe. While you are out of it, I will draw up a schedule that will get you into a good enough condition to accept one of my tales within the next few months. The Kyuubi then gave her a rather sadistic smirk. I hope you are prepared, Kit. Naruto swallowed rather nervously at the look of anticipation on the face of her new foster mother. She then gave her head a small shake to get rid of the apprehension rising in her gut and then nodded fiercely. I'm ready, Kyuubi-san. The smirk widened into a smile and the Kyuubi gave the girl a swift hug before setting her back into the snow and standing upright. Good. As a tide of red chakra swept the small girl out of the mindscape and back to the land of the living, the fox muttered to herself, I really hope you are ready for this, Kit. So now you will die, demon. As the kunai rapidly descended to slash into the girl's unresponsive eye, Naruto suddenly awoke to what was about to happen and managed to close her eye and tilt her head just far enough away from the sharp implement that it wouldn't completely blind her. Feeling a warm, all-encompassing energy begin to flow into her body from the seal, she began to struggle anew at her restraints as her tormentors were blown back with the sudden upsurge in energy. Wincing at the pain in her hands, the girl, at the urging of the almost sentient energy, harshly ripped one of her hands free of the kunai and then reached over to rip out the one pinning her other hand to the floor. Springing to her feet, the girl paid no attention to the rapid healing of her worst wounds, focusing instead on the mob that was just regaining their bearings after being flung all over the room by the first surge of the Kyuubi's chakra. Trying to suppress the overwhelming bloodlust rising in her at the sight of the mob of mentally deficient imbeciles that were attempting to kill her, the girl was about to open her mouth to ask them that all-encompassing question, why? When she was interrupted before she could even begin by one of the leaders of the group. There! The demon has revealed itself. Kill it before it kills all of us. At this shout, the people that made up the mob almost became unrecognizable as human themselves. Mouths frothing with a madness-inducing combination of fear and anger, the mass of frenzied bodies hurled themselves at the small form of the girl they had come to hunt. If what they want is a demon, I'll give them one. Kyuubi-san, the girl's voice snarled through the mindscape and was answered with confirmation of the immense creature's existence. I am here, Kit. You best prepare for some fire. Even with this warning, the girl had no time to do so as the red aura that surrounded her small frame pulsed once and then shifted into a roaring corona of fire. The voice that then emerged from the young girl's throat was only partly hers. Kitsune Bi. The yell wasn't even acknowledged by the swiftly approaching attackers, and they only had time to give brief cut-off screams as the blue-white flames swiftly engulfed the building. At the fox's urging, the girl swiftly followed the spreading flames, untouched by the intense heat. Grabbing one of the few that didn't vaporize on the spot as witness and scapegoat on the vixen's suggestion, the girl calmly made her way out of the collapsing building. As soon as they were clear of the danger, the Kyuubi's energy immediately began to retreat from the girl's body, leaving her trembling and cold as she staggered a few uncertain steps in the direction of the Hokage as he rushed towards her. Barely feeling him lift her off the ground, she softly muttered something nonsensical she doubted she'd remember when she woke up and finally passed out. Her more severe injuries had already been mostly healed by the time you got her here. The only thing that might cause problems for her is that eye. It won't be completely confirmed until she actually wakes up, but it's very likely that she'll be at least partially blind. An injury like that is honestly very rare, and because it also affected her temple area, it's impossible to know how completely it'll affect her until she's fully aware. Naruto, waking again, frowned slightly at the slightly muffled voice of the woman describing injuries right outside of her door. She frowned even more as she recognized the voice of the old man replying. And will she have any visible scarring? Especially on her face. The sandame's voice grew louder and clearer as she heard her door open as well. She continued to listen in slowly growing horror as she realized that the one they were speaking about was her. She opened the one eye she could to watch as well. Sadly enough, yes. The person who cut into her eye must have heated the kunai as far as he could without melting it and was wearing gloves when they went to slice open that eye. Not only will she have a clear-cut scar on either side of the eye, across part of her nose and around over her temple and up into her hairline, but there will be thin burned scars spreading out from the original cut as well. A simple eye patch won't be able to cover it. She'll also always have those crucifixion scars through her hands as well. I'm honestly surprised she'll be able to use her hands at all. With the way she was pinned, she should have never been able to move her fingers again. I suppose that cursed fox came in handy somehow then. Giving a harsh sigh, the third turned to look at where the previously comatose girl was lying and was more than startled to meet the gaze of the girl's only undamaged eye. Nariko! You're finally awake then, he said, sighing in relief. Thank God. Nariko slowly made to sit up and the healer hurried forward to assist her and then left them alone, knowing that the sandame had all the information they did on her condition. Not God, Sarujiji, Kyuubi. Kyu, you know then? Yeah. Why didn't you tell me about it, Jiji? As she said this, the girl turned her head to look out the window towards the slowly rising sun. The old man gave a tired sigh and followed the girl's gaze. He lowered his eyelids slightly against the sun's bright rays as he answered as honestly as he could. Partly because I wanted you to have as much of a childhood as I could give you. Originally I had only meant for the council to know, and once I told them I made the circumstances of the Kyuubi's defeat a SS-class secret, but one of them blabbed, and before I could do any damage control half the village thought you were the Kyuubi reborn. The other reason is that, until recently at least, you were just too young to understand the consequences of telling just anybody about it. You are only 6 after all. The girl drew her eye from the window to look straight at him as she replied, I can understand that, and my parents. I'm afraid I can't tell you who they, no. I already know who they are. As the third gaped rather unattractively at her, Nariko continued, unperturbed, what I meant was why you didn't tell me anything about them. Pulling himself together, he answered rather woodenly, once again, it's because you were too young. Frowning slightly, he continued, can you honestly tell me that you wouldn't have bragged about who they were? Conceding the point, the girl turned to look back out the window and changed the subject. So how long have I been out for? Almost 2 days. With injuries like yours, anyone else would have been out for at least a week. The girl simply nodded as if she had expected something like that. The old man, on the other hand, still had some questions for her. Who told you about all of this, Nariko? Said girl gave the old man an odd look and said, as if stating the obvious, the Kyuubi of course, with an innocently wide eye that belied the immensity of the revelation. Choking on what he was about to say, the third could only make a few incoherent sputtering noises as the girl continued to explain some of what the Kyuubi had told her. Needless to say, while she told him that she and the Kyuubi and made a deal of sorts, she left out any mention of being the fox's heir. Relaxing a bit after the explanation, they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Nariko reached up to begin unwinding the bandages from around her head. When Sarutabi made to stop her, she said that the Kyuubi had told her it was about as healed as it was ever going to be and she might as well take a look at the damage. Sighing resignedly at the girl's stubbornness, as she finished unwrapping the bandages and removed the pad cushioning her eye, he reached over to the side table to grab a small mirror placed there for that purpose. Turning back to face her, he winced slightly at the sight of the scars and, with guilty eyes, placed the mirror in her outstretched hand. Forewarned by the Hokage's grimace, Nariko took a deep breath before she looked into the reflective surface of the mirror. It was both worse than and not as bad as she thought it might be. A thick pink scar carved deeply into the left side of the bridge of her nose before it skidded up over her eyelid, making it so it wouldn't open fully and giving the eye itself a lazy, half-lidded quality. The scar then jerked down slightly to etch itself over the bone of her eye socket before drawing sharply off over her temple and smoothing into the hairline. Off of every part of the main scar, lighter and thinner burned scars drew themselves in spiderwebs across her forehead and cheek. They faded into non-existence as they reached her hairline and mouth. The eye itself no longer had a discernible iris and sclera. The entirety of the orb was a pale blue, almost white, color that reminded one of ice, with a barely discernible pupil of a slightly darker color that was almost invisible. The entire effect was rather unnerving, and Sarutabi would be rather ashamed to admit that when the girl asked him what kind of mask she would be able to wear, he was a bit relieved. They sat and talked for a while, as Sarutabi wouldn't have to get to the Hokage Tower for a while, before the subject of Nariko's parents came up again. Did they leave me some kind of house that I could live in? Well, it would be a bad idea to reveal who your father is to anyone by having you blatantly live where he did. Your mother rented out a flat, but I believe she inherited some land from Maito-sama. I'll take a look at what it was and get back to you on that later. That okay? It's fine. Glancing out the window again, Noriko couldn't help the next comment, and don't you have a job to do? As she watched the Sandaime glance at the clock and realized the time, she said, don't forget to bring me some ramen when you visit next. Hospital food sucks. The third gave her an indulgent nod as he puffed out of the room with a casual shunshin technique. She then pouted as a nurse rolled in a trolley with a tray of said suckish hospital food. Looking through the records of what the girl's parents had left to her, the third could only gape in shock when he realized that Uzumaki Kushina had left her daughter the forest of death and the tower in its center. Oh dear. And she'll probably love the place to death as well. Sighing at his unintentional pun, he considered what the council would have to say about this. After he had gotten the blonde girl to the hospital, while the girl was in the emergency room, he had immediately summoned some of his best investigative Anbu agents and set them to uncover what exactly led to the massive mistake that had resulted in his favorite blonde being scared for life. He knew very well it could have been much worse. What was found was horrifying. One of the so-called minor concessions he had given up to appease the council was to allow a few civilians to work at the Hokuge Tower. A few of the more major civilian clans had hired a freelance infiltration specialist, had hidden him in with the few other oblivious people they put to work in the tower. Over the course of the last year, the man had slowly found out how Noriko's guard shifts were recorded and maintained. Following his orders to the letter, he had secretly and slowly manipulated the shift times to include an hour of time when the girl would be unguarded. It had fallen rather coincidentally on the 10th of October, exactly 6 years after the Kyuubi had been defeated. When they received the news, the civilian council men and women quickly spread the news to those who, much like themselves, hated the child and what she contained beyond all reason. Thus followed the attack, and, needless to say, most of what had been the civilian council were no longer among the living. At least half of them were killed when Noriko's apartment building went up in flames. The one rescued by Noriko, was currently enjoying a prolonged stay in the Anbu's Tianai division. The others were publicly executed for treason, conspiracy to murder, one under the protection of both the Hokuge and Daimyo, and the breaking of the Sandaime's law. After he had completed his mission, the nameless agent had immediately fled Konoha, but by now it was too late. Ainu was hot on his trail, and the Hokuge was expecting the man to return with the so-called specialist's head any day now. The Yondaime's last surviving student knew exactly who the girl's parents were, and killing the person who made the attack possible in the first place would help relive some of his not inconsequential anger. With the civilian council all but eradicated, it was decided by the shinobi council not to reinstate it. They could all now see that such an undermining of the Hokuge's authority weakened the village as a whole. However, with the civilian council gone, the shinobi one had to pick up the slack. On the Hokuge's orders, some of the higher-ranking ninja, such as the Anbu commander and the head of the Hunter Nin Corps, have now taken on positions in the council in order to take on some of the work. After going through some of the things the civilian council had had a say in, such as what was taught at the Ninja Academy, Sarutobi could only think that the disbanding of the civilian council was an even better idea than he had originally thought. They had actually let fangirls keep that mentality after their second year at the academy and even let them pass their final exams? Ridiculous. Turning his thoughts back to what he had originally been planning, he knew that at the very least he'd have to tell the council who her mother was in order for the girl to be able to live in the forest. Taking the deed and everything else her mother had left her with him, he left to tell the council and give Noriko half of her inheritance. After he left the office, a ninja pulled himself up from where he had been hidden in the floor and was immediately killed by a Koge bunch in the old Hokuge had made, hidden, and left behind. Examining the blank mask, the clone scowled to itself and muttered under its breath, "Damn that Danzo. He's getting bolder." Turning back to the body, it burned it to a crisp with a minor fire jutsu. As the ashes flowed on a breeze out the window, it dispersed itself, sending the memories of its short existence back to its creator. Noriko, having fallen asleep again as she waited to be released from the hospital, woke up in her mind's cape. She just lay there for a while, watching as the snow fell down into her face and disappeared as it touched her skin. She wasn't very surprised when the Kyuubi bent her head into her line of vision to look down at her. "Well? Are you just going to lie there all day, Kit?" asked the kitsune. "No." "Oh. Okay then." As she looked down at the peaceful face of the little girl, the Kyuubi noticed that the scars on her body had yet to manifest themselves on the mental plane. Clearly the girl had yet to accept the injuries as a part of who she was, but that was understandable. To expect such mental maturity in a 6-year-old was ludicrous. Shaking her head slightly at the direction of her thoughts, the fox glanced at the snow, and after taking another look at the girl lay down next to her, her feet facing the opposite direction as their hair curled together in the white drifts of snow. She didn't move even after the child left the mindscape. And the snow kept falling. "Well," said the medic as the green glow of medical chakra faded from the hand she had just removed from Nariko's eye, "it seems like you've recovered nicely." She continued speaking as she ignored the door opening behind her and the man who walked through it. "Once you get dressed, you're free to go." "Really?" asked Nariko in excitement as she practically bounced off the bed she had spent the last few days in. "Really," the healer replied as she stood herself and picked up the girl's medical chart from the small table beside the bed. As she turned to leave the room, she continued, "I'll just take this down to the nurse's station while you talk with Hokuji-sama, all right?" She gave the girl a small smile and the sandaime a swift bow and left. The Hokuji followed the woman with his eyes as she removed herself from the room and then turned back to his favorite blonde, bringing out the bowl ramen he had been hiding from the hospital staff as he did so. Receiving her instant attention at the sight and smell of what she had long since deemed the food of the gods, he quickly handed it over before she took his hand along with the ramen. As he watched her begin to devour her favorite food, he reflected on the behavior of the woman who had just left. He was beyond grateful that the Hippocratic Oath existed. Because every medic that worked at the hospital had taken the oath at one point or another, none of them could refuse to treat Nariko. As a consequence, they were forced to give the girl a chance and, almost without exception, they had found that they couldn't hate her. In their minds, the Kyuubi and Nariko were two entirely different beings. They just couldn't connect the immense bloodlust and hatred they had felt from the bijou to the small blonde girl who was always smiling and cheerful. In fact, many of them eventually came to like her, and those who were merely neutral treated her with the same honesty and respect they did all of their patients. Shaking off the introspective thoughts, he turned his attention back to the small girl and blinked in shock when he saw the child staring at an empty bowl mournfully. In order to distract her from the depressing realization that ramen was gone, he began to speak. "It turns out I was right, Mito-sama did leave your mother something, and she in turn has left it to you. It's more than far enough away from the main part of the village that you won't have to worry about any more attacks, and on that note, it may be a good idea for you to hide out there for a while. Having you in the public eye so soon after the deaths of so many civilians and the changes on the council would just be asking for trouble." The old Hokuji sighed and shook his head at the last point, and Nariko couldn't help but nod in agreement. The villagers were bad enough already. She didn't want to know what would happen if they had even more of a reason to hate her. Back to the original point though, the place is an old, mostly abandoned at this point, Anbu training ground called the Forest of Death and includes the tower in the center. The Forest of Death? The girl couldn't help but ask. "Yes. I'm sure you'll understand once you actually see the place." The first thing she noticed was how tall the trees were. From where she was standing, just outside the chain link fence with barbed wire tops that surrounded the area, they almost seemed to go on forever. The second thing she noticed was how dark it was. The thick canopy of leaves that covered the topmost branches of the trees blocked out the sun, and she could tell that the majority of the forest was forever wrapped in darkness. The sound of the wind blowing through the trees made an eerie whistling sound, and when it was accompanied by the occasional scream of a dying animal, she could see why humans might find it unnerving enough to call it a forest of death. She turned back the Hokuji to see him watching expectantly, waiting to hear what she thought of the place. "I love it!" she exclaimed honestly, and the third shook his head in bemusement. He'd heard Kushina had a similar reaction to the forest the first time she saw it. He might have suspected that the reaction was unique to the Kyuubi containers if it weren't for Mitarashi Anko's obsession with the forest as well. After all, the only other person to have ever lived in it on a permanent basis aside from Nariko was the first Kyuubi Jinchuuriki, Senju Uzumaki Mito. "Well, let's go see the tower before you make your decision, my dear," he said. He then picked her up and, trailed by his ever-present and persistent Anbu guards, sped through the gate and jumped up into the tree tops, quickly disappearing into the forest. The tower in the center of the forest really didn't look like anything special. It towered, much like a tower should, over the old man and his charge as they landed in the clearing that surrounded it. As the girl inspected the tower as well as she could from her position in the Hokuji's arms, she looked a little unimpressed with its initial appearance. Then the Hokuji began to speak. "The tower has about 6, maybe 7, floors all told. I myself have never been past the third one. In order to even get to that third floor, you must have an invitation from an Uzumaki accepted by the seal ward that covers the tower itself." The girl had returned her attention to the third, and as he spoke was becoming more and more impressed with the things seals could do. Before, after she first learned that the Kyuubi was held inside her, she had resolved to learn something about them herself, if only to know what was going on with her own seal, as it was changed by the agreement she had made with the Kyuubi. She was now beginning to see the benefits of doing so for her own benefit. The Hokage himself, oblivious to the small girl's speculative thoughts, continued. It should be easy enough for you to be accepted by the ward. However, once you are, I know you'll be safe here, as you are the last Uzumaki. Sadly, I won't be able to explore the rest of the tower with you today, as I have to return to my paperwork. The girl was a bit sad that she wouldn't have any company, but nodded in understanding as the man put her down and opened the tower's door. As they made their way to the entrance to the third floor, Sarutobi gave Nariko a bit of a tour of the Fist 2 stories. He pointed out the arena that was normally only used for the annual Chunan exams. He had to explain what a Chunan exam was when he mentioned this, and the surveillance room next to it as they moved out of the entrance hall. He also showed her a couple of the training rooms that took up the rest of the first floor. The second floor mostly consisted of bedrooms set up for those who were visiting the tower but weren't allowed past the second floor. The only other thing there was a couple of spacious offices for those who had to hold meetings in the tower itself for one reason or another. As they reached the door at the end of one of the many hallways of the second floor, the Hokage turned to Nariko and said, "This is the only way, that I know of at least, to get to the rest of the tower. Bite your finger enough for a bit of blood to come out and place your hand on the door." The girl looked doubtfully at the utterly normal-looking door, but complied, biting a finger on her right hand and gingerly laying the appendage against the wooden door. Immediately after she did so, seals, glowing a bloody red around the edges, spread from the point where her small hand made contact with the door. They etched themselves across the door, but didn't stop there as they swiftly moved to cover the entire tower and the land around it with their markings. The old Hokage watched in awe as they pulsed once and glowed blue for a second before sinking into the materials that made up the tower. The Sandaime then returned his attention to the girl as she removed her hand from the door and sagged down to land on her knees, holding her head as if in pain with her other hand as she did so. "Are you all right, Nariko?" he asked with concern as he hovered over her hunched form, unsure of what he should do. While he knew the bare basics of sealing, as did every ninja of above Chunan level, he also knew that the ward work on this tower was unsurpassed by anything else in the village except for the seal barrier surrounding it, and perhaps his predecessor's house. "I'm fine," she replied after a moment, and then continued, "It's just that when I connected with the barrier, and it accepted me, a lot of information I wasn't really ready for seemed to almost pour into my brain." The old man calmed down a bit at this, beginning to assume that it was similar to the effect of memories returning from a shadow clone. Then the girl continued to speak, and the man's, as well as the invisible Ambus, eyes widened in incredulousness. "I now know exactly how to manipulate the ward. I could even stretch it to include the entire forest of death if I wanted to. I know exactly how many people are in the tower and how many rooms and floors it has. It's almost like I have a little living map of the place in the back of my head. I couldn't get lost here if I wanted to." She opened her mouth to continue, but then immediately closed it, realizing that she was beginning to babble. The Hokage, after a moment, suppressed his shock and began to consider the advantages and disadvantages of such a thing. He then replied, "Well, that's certainly a surprise, but a good one, I think. Perhaps when I leave you could place the whole tower under the barrier. It would make you that much safer at least." The girl thought for a moment and then agreed. The Hokage then leaned down to give the blonde a hug before saying goodbye and telling her he'll visit when he can. He then disappeared in a puff of smoke, swiftly followed by the Anbu she had noticed when the wards connected to her. Nariko then turned back to the door and opened it for the first time. As she had known, she would, the only thing immediately visible were stairs that went up quite a few steps and then disappeared onto a balcony. She went up the stairs and stepped out onto the balcony. The giant room it overlooked took up the entirety of this floor of the tower. The room stretched up to reach about 14 feet at the ceiling. The balcony itself wasn't so much a balcony as a floor within a floor. It was raised about 5 feet off the main part of the room and reached about 12 feet into it. It was covered with a blue and green carpet and edged with a wooded rail that was broken only by the 6 or so small staircases that provided a way to get down to the main part of the massive room. She moved forward to lean against the rail and take in the room. The walls themselves were bare except for evenly placed lamps, the occasional window, and the mural that covered it. The mural was made up of what seemed like a hypnotic abstract made of ribbons of every color you could ever imagine. However, as Nariko now knew, it wasn't a mural at all, but instead the matrix for the seal barrier that enveloped the entirety of the forest of death. Depending on what she wanted the barrier to do, the colors and patterns would almost imperceptibly shift themselves to reflect their purpose. The best part was that anyone who she invited into this room who wasn't a true seal master at the level of her great-great-aunt, who were quite rare as far as she knew, would only see what it appeared to be an elaborate mural. The space directly beneath the balcony was taken up by storage space. What was in each large cupboard was listed on discrete pieces of paper pinned next to the doors of each. The room itself consisted of what seemed to be a spacious combination of a living room, dining room, and kitchen. One part of it was a living family room combo that had many couches and armchairs of varying colors and patterns spread out all over it. The carpet that covered the area was made up of warm colors, like soft red, pale yellow, and dark orange, with neutral patterns that merged seamlessly with the colors and patterns of the other areas. It gave off a warm and cozy feeling, despite the size of the room. Another part of it would have seemed to be a simple dining room area, if it weren't for the positively massive table that took up the majority of the space. It was low, like most traditional tables, but that was where the similarity ended. It was made of what looked like a sleek cherry wood, and the visible whorls were shaped in graceful and undefined patterns, giving it a mysterious air. There were at least 15 cushions surrounding the table, though she couldn't count them all accurately from where she was. The colors of area were cool and reminiscent of the ocean. The carpet and the cushions were done in various shades of blue, green, and the occasional soft gray. It was in a direct, but complementing, contrast to the theme of the living room area. The last part of the room was taken up by a massive and rather elaborately set up kitchen. It was clearly equipped to handle cooking for many people at the same time. The long counter lined up precisely where the carpeting of the other parts of the room ended, with two small openings into each of the areas placed strategically for easiest access. Various small cooking appliances, such as the microwave, toaster, and rice cooker, were set up along the counter, neatly cleaned after whenever their last use was. On the other side of the kitchen area, much like in the living and dining room areas, two staircases reached up to the balcony, for lack of a better thing to call it. However, in between the staircases, instead of storage cupboards, there were the larger appliances that were missing from the counter area. The dishwasher, oven, stove, and two refrigerators took up most of the space there. The only part of that circling wall that wasn't covered by the kitchen appliances was the aforementioned staircases, and what appeared to be a fully stocked pantry, lined with preservative seals to ensure that the food within wouldn't go bad. The kitchen didn't have as distinctive a color pattern as the other parts of the room and was mostly done up in neutral colors. The counters were made up of wood, and the cabinets holding kitchen supplies and dishes that they stood on were of a soft golden brown marble with wooden doors matching the wood of the counter. The floor was made of a dark hardwood that the girl couldn't identify, and the appliances were made of a soft gray that contrasted nicely with the warm color of the woods. She then noticed, and remembered, the two doors on the other side of the room. One, she knew, went to the 4th floor. The other led to a bathroom. Whoever lived here last must have been a generally social person who had people over visiting regularly. She reflected for a moment on the novelty of a family that cared enough about her to leave her such a marvelous place to live before pushing aside her musings for another time. She then turned back to the mural and slowly and carefully, so as to be sure she didn't make a mistake, shifted the tower's barrier so that it encompassed the whole tower. She'd have to remember to put the old man into that acceptable people list for the seal barrier, at least for the first few floors. She had a feeling that it would be a while before she would be able to put any more people on it. The only other people she might trust enough to give access to the upper levels of the tower were Tuchiji and Ayame, and they wouldn't be able to get past the forest to visit her as they were only civilians. An hour later she had finished manipulating the tower's wards to her liking. Aside from extending the Uzumaki invited-only award to include the entire tower, she set the pest wards on the tower to include snakes, which she suddenly severely disliked. She wondered if it was an effect of her new bond with the Kyuubi, and cancelled any permission that her mother or great-great-aunt may have given people to enter the tower. She left the rest of the barrier wards on the tower itself alone. She had then considered the forest and examined what was in place on it. There weren't many, but those there were kind of impressive. There was one that induced a severe avoidance of the forest to anyone not of Uzumaki blood. Those that were affected could enter, but they would really not want to be there. The closer they got to the tower, the more uneasy they would get, but once they were safely ensconced in the tower, they would be able to relax. Most ninja listened to their instincts, as they had probably saved their lives more than once, so it acted as a fairly effective deterrent. There were a few more dormant security wards as well, such as those that would let her know when people entered and left the forest, and another that would give anyone she didn't want to be there a severe shock. It would start off as an almost unnoticeable static shock, but would swiftly get deadly the longer they stayed. She awakened those and, unable to think of anything else to do to them, stepped back from the mural. The mural seemed almost unchanged, but upon a closer look a few of the colors had shifted places or brightened and a new one altogether wound its way through the ribbons of color. Satisfied, the girl moved away from the wall to get something to eat before she completed her exploration of the tower. She was quite gratified to find some instant ramen in the pantry. As she looked over the crates of the stuff, she wondered if her ramen addiction was hereditary. It might explain some things, but she quickly dismissed the thought and, taking some cup ramen with her, returned to the kitchen. After she finished her dinner, 20 cups of ramen if you want to know, she turned to the doors she had previously noticed from the other side of the room and opened the one leading to the next floor, making her way up yet another flight of stairs. As she had already known, the fourth floor consisted of mostly identical guest bedrooms that were spacious and comfortable enough that one could easily live in them full-time, including futon or bed, dresser, closet, and bathroom. The stairs that Naruto had climbed lead to a short hall that ended in a circular sitting area in the center of the fourth story. The walls that circled the area were set with doors at regular intervals. She knew that each one led to a room with a different color scheme, the small patch of color on each of the white doors indicating which was which. The sitting area itself was decorated with an odd red and silver color scheme that somehow worked quite well with the starkly white doors and odd color patches. In the very center of the circular room, a spiral staircase stretched up and through the ceiling. Not seeing any need to stay on the fourth floor any longer, she made her way to the staircase and began to climb, swiftly putting the red and silver patterned carpet further and further beneath her feet. She quickly passed through the floor that separated the fourth and fifth stories and emerged onto a circular wooden platform edged with a rail made of the same metal as the wrought iron staircase she had just climbed. The room on the fifth floor was a library that, much like the third floor, took up the entire space. However, the ceiling reached up much higher than the ones on that floor. In fact, this room may have been able to count as 2 stories in and of itself. The first floor was that of a normal, if large, library. Bookshelves lined the walls, and ones much taller than the ones against the wall stood in seemingly random positions all over the rest of the library, stretching up to reach the exceedingly tall ceiling. She was glad for the ladders that were attached to each of the shelves. If they weren't there, she wouldn't be able to reach the books on the higher shelves. They were close to overflowing with different books and scrolls, and as she went over to examine a few of them, Naruto was excited to learn that a lot of them were on seals. She then noticed that there were several nooks that looked tailor-made for curling up away from the world with a good book in, as well as several chairs and couches set up in groups that looked quite absurdly comfy. At the other side of the library, a double-sided staircase led up to a door that undoubtedly led to the 6th floor and balcony, a true balcony, not like the one on the 3rd floor, that wrapped around the room at least 12 or 13 feet up in the air. On the balcony, even more bookshelves, but these ones with barely any books on them, wrapped around the room again. Putting aside what seemed destined to become one of her favorite rooms for the moment, she crossed the room and made her way up the stairs and through the door at the top of them. Behind the door were more stairs that, as she already knew, led to one of the last floors. The 6th floor contained the more private rooms of the tower. It held the master bedroom, the master bath, private training rooms, and a sealing room that her great-great-aunt had probably used for her more elaborate and private ceilings. Already knowing the basic layout of this floor, she quickly made her way to the center of the story and the spiral staircase that led to last floor of the tower. She wanted to see it before she went to sleep. She slowly made her way up the stairs and emerged on the other side of the ceiling. It turns out that the roof of the tower wasn't the stone it appeared to be from the outside, but glass panels with carefully applied illusion seals. The entirety of the 7th and last floor was a beautiful greenhouse garden that had slightly fallen to ruin since the tower last had inhabitants, over 2 decades now from what she knew. It was still beautiful though, and the moonlight that had begun to shine through the glass made it even more so. She resolved to clean it up at some point soon. Naruto then gave a large yawn and turned to go back down the staircase. When she opened the door of the master bedroom 10 minutes later, she was almost dead on her feet. Not having the energy to examine the bedroom as closely as she had the others in the tower, she gave a jaw-breaking yawn, removed her outer clothes and climbed onto the bed, swiftly slipping beneath the covers. As she curled up in bed, she didn't immediately fall asleep but closed her eyes, basking in the feeling of finally being somewhere she could truly call home. Before she fully fell asleep, she gave a thought to how the Kyuubi might react to her changed circumstances, and so, pondering the fox's reaction, she fell into a deep sleep. Naruto woke up what felt like hours later, the voice of what immediately recognized as the Kyuubi. It was a bit unforgettable after all. "All right, Kit. It is time to get up." She felt justified in wanting to sleep more though. She'd had a tiring day after all. "Wake up, Naruto." However, when she began to detect an annoyed tone in the vixen's voice, she thought maybe it might be a good idea to get up after all. I'm up. I'm up, the young girl exclaimed, propping herself up on her elbows. She was surprised when her arms began to sink into the snow though, and, looking up to catch sight of an enormous sakura tree and the human form of the Kyuubi, who was looking a tad annoyed, she realized she was back in her mindscape. Once she was sure that her charge was awake and aware, the woman sat down in front of her and, drawing herself up into a dramatic pose, made an announcement. Now that we have an appropriate place to train, you will begin your training under me to become an appropriate heir. I hope you are prepared, Kit. Seeing the look of sadistic anticipation on the face of the kitsune as she looked down at her with a smirk, Nariko gulped in apprehension and began to sweat a bit. She supposed it was too late to back out of that deal, huh? Yes, far, far too late, Nariko Kit. When Nariko woke up the next morning, she was unsure of where she was. It was far too comfortable to be the hospital, and her apartment had burned down. Oh well, she wanted to get more sleep anyway. Not even bothering to open her eyes, she turned over and quickly dozed off again. She'd probably remember when she woke up next anyway. Get your ass out of that bed, Nariko. When the yell of her bijou roared through her mind, the girl bolted straight up in said bed, tangling herself in her sheets. She lost her balance as she tried to untangle herself and fell right out of the bed, hitting the floor with a sharp thud that was muffled by the soft carpet that stretched over the floor and a high-pitched yelp. What was that for, Kyuubi? She shouted to thin air. Had anyone seen it, they would have probably thought her crazy. Well, anyone who didn't know who and what she was. Then they'd, depending on who they were, either take her to the Hokage or try to kill her. When the Kyuubi pointed this out to her, Kit, she groaned and sighed, rubbing at the bump on her head that was already going down. So why did you wake me up like that, Kyuubi-san? She asked in her mind, a bit more politely this time. Why, it's time to begin your training, the fox replied almost cheerfully. Surely you haven't forgotten last night already? No, how could I? The girl almost groaned. She then stood up, stretched, and took a look around the bedroom she'd ended up falling asleep in. It, much like many of the rooms in the tower, had a specific color pattern. This one gave the feeling of sleeping on a cloud. Various shades of light blues interspersed with accents of dark blue made up the majority of the room's decorations and colors. The bed itself though was big, fluffy, and completely white. She loved it. Then she sighed and put on the clothes she had discarded the last day. It was time to train. 2 months later, Nariko was meditating. Any uninformed person who saw her would have thought she was sleeping though. She was just lying in a hammock in the greenhouse she had indeed remodeled, just as she had said she would, after all. Nariko didn't like breaking her promises, even ones she made to herself. The Kyuubi had told her it was something she had inherited from her. She didn't really mind. Back to the meditating though, it was something she had done quite regularly over the past couple of months. When she had woken up that day, she had indeed planned to get straight to training. However, the moment she had stepped out of her room, her stomach had immediately growled, leading to an immediate retreat down all those stairs to the kitchen, where she had immediately begun to devour horrendously large quantities of ramen. Well, until the Kyuubi pointed a few things out to her at least. First was that with the way she was eating the stuff, they'd be out of instant ramen within a week and they had no way to restock. Second was the fact that all of the ramen she eats had been stunting her growth, that without the Kyuubi being sealed inside her, she'd have already been suffering from malnutrition. The limited calorie intake of the ramen may have sufficed when she had no other choice, but now she had a fully stocked pantry to take advantage of. When the girl had begun to protest, the fox had told her that a couple cups a day wouldn't be a problem, but eating nothing but the stuff would be. It was then that the budding argument was interrupted by the seal wards telling her that someone was fast approaching the tower. When asked for a description, the barrier had given her one that quite closely matched that of the old Hokage. The only discrepancy was that both he and a few of his ever-present guards were weighed down by more than a few bags and packages. She had immediately raced down the stairs to the main door and opened it just as the old man and his bodyguards landed in the front lawn. The Hokage had brought her some clothes, food, and a few other things like toothpaste and soap, just in case the tower didn't have any. She had quickly invited the old man in, leaving his ever-present shadows to guard the tower itself instead of their primary charge, since they couldn't get in. The girl herself had led the old man up to the 3rd floor, where they both had sat at the massive dining table as she finished her breakfast of ramen, and more ramen. The Hokage had told her he couldn't stay long and that he had just come to bring her some clothes and necessities. He himself had had no idea what to get for the girl and so had let a trusted female Anbu do the shopping. That, he said, was why there was so much of the stuff. He had stayed and talked with the girl for a while but soon had to leave. Nariko had finished her ramen by that point and bid the old man a fond farewell. She had then, on the Kyuubi's urging, found herself in one of the private training rooms on the 6th floor where she had soon begun to train under the Kyuubi's direction. Over the course of the next couple of months the Kyuubi had indeed pushed her hard, but just as the fox had known she would, Nariko had pushed back even harder. The Kyuubi had begun with the basics. The first part of the morning would begin with physical exercises, push-ups, pull-ups, squats, sit-ups, crunches, the whole 9 yards. Every time the young girl came close to getting used to the set amount of exercises, the fox would immediately double them. As a result, the girl remained mostly unaware of her growing strength for the better part of a month, and the Kyuubi had to increase the amount of what she did at least 3 times a week. After this, the vixen would have Nariko meditate and enter her mindscape. There the fox began to teach her kitsune lore, customs, and magic. Nariko herself didn't even have a single tail yet, so the majority of the magic lessons were theory, but even the most minor of kitsune were masters of deception, illusion, and transformation. As a result, even if she didn't have the power to do even the most minor of kitsune magic, her general behaviors began to reflect the expectations of the Kyuubi. However, the fact that most kitsune antics required either an audience or a victim stunted this a bit. The girl would then go down to the kitchen for a midday meal and then immediately retreat back to the training room she had recently vacated once done eating. There she would practice with her chakra for the rest of the day. She had easily been able to find it on the first day, so the next 2 weeks consisted of her practicing moving it about her body until it moved the way she wanted it to instantly and at her slightest whim. The rest of the month was spent practicing the leaf sticking exercise. She would stop her chakra practice at around 6 or 7 o'clock and go make something for dinner. After dinner, she would more often than not occupy herself in the library learning about sealing and chakra theory from both the Kyuubi and the books stored there. Though occasionally she would relax with a good story as well. A month into the training, the physical exercises were, at Nariko's insistence, switched with the physical work of remodeling the old greenhouse at the top of the tower. As long as the girl was working out extensively, the fox didn't have a problem with it and even helped the girl out at times by pointing out extra things that could be done. The rest of her days, however, stayed mostly the same. The only other difference was in her chakra training. Around the same time Nariko had begun restoring the greenhouse, the fox had her sticking first 1, and then multiple, leaves on different points of her body and moving them around with only her chakra. The fox said it would help with her control, reserves, and multitasking skills, and it most certainly did, but Nariko found this to be the hardest exercise by far. Even the tree walking exercise she had mastered in the last week didn't compare to the difficulty of sticking 20 leaves to different parts of your body and moving them around in random individual patterns. She had finished renovating the greenhouse only yesterday, and it looked quite good, if she did say so herself. Maybe, when she had more time, she'd turn part of the space around her tower into another garden. The greenhouse, much like a few of the other tower rooms, took up the entirety of the 7th floor. Arranged in a spiral pattern, the plant started at the edge of the walls and moved in a spacious spiral that only wrapped around the room 4 or 5 times before reaching the center where the spiral staircase emerged from the floor. In the space between the plants, a walkway made its way, gradually leading a person who walked down it from the staircase to the windows that made up the walls. Where the spiral of tatami mats ended at the edge closest to the window, a small space to sit and admire either the view or the flowers, or both, was set up. A small traditional table was placed here with a tea-making set laid out neatly on it. A few cushions surrounded it, but the hammock that was in sight of the small area, tied between 2 young blossoming cherry trees, seemed to be severely out of place. The young girl that laid there resembled the one who had so eagerly watched the fireworks almost 3 months ago, but it was a distant resemblance at best, relying on only the coloring and facial features to give truth to the supposition that they were indeed the same person. The left side of Nariko's face was completely covered by a mask that fit the form of her face too perfectly to be anything but a custom job. The pale grey, almost sliver but not quite, color of the mask was obscured by long strands of bright hair that reached the middle of the girl's back when she stood up straight. Currently released from its customary loose braid, the rest of what she considered her only vanity spilled over the edge of the hammock and swayed with the girl's soft breathing. She was wearing a deceptively soft yukata that looked to be a size too large for her, what with the loose fit and extra long sleeves that completely covered her hands. Made of layered grey chakra-infused silk, it would stop anything but a direct strike from a kunai or sword in its tracks and even lessen damage from low-level jutsu. It was bound at her waist with a soft yellow sash tied in a bow. Underneath it she wore only a fishnet bodysuit over spandex shorts and a short, tight shirt of the same material that, were she older, may have been termed a sports bra. Her hands were almost impossible to discern from where they were curled into fists and hidden deep in the sleeves of her garment, were they visible, though it would be apparent that she was wearing slim black gloves with dull metal backs. Her bare feet also curled up beneath the edges of the yukata. She looked incredibly relaxed, but, as I'm sure I've mentioned, she was meditating, so it was to be expected. Inside her mind's cape, Kyuubi-san, do you think I'm ready? She asked the woman sitting in the tree above her. Even in her mindscape, her ever-present mask made its appearance and was brought to attention with the way she was nervously running a hand through her long hair. Of course you are, I would not suggest it otherwise, but getting that old man to agree might be a bit difficult, I admit. The fox replied. The two of them had agreed to attempt to convince the Hokage to allow Nariko to enter the academy early. The old man had seen some of the ways she trained when he came over to visit, but he had no idea that his small friend was, at the least, low genin level. In order to convince the old man that she was ready, they had decided she had to leave the forest herself and visit him in the tower. If that didn't surprise him, nothing will. He still didn't know that over the course of the past few weeks she'd been leaving the forest to play increasingly elaborate pranks on the stiffs in the village. She figured that if nothing else, playing a successful prank on both the Uchiha military police and the Hyuga clan would convince him to let her take a shot at it. The showing up in his office unexpectedly would cause enough shock to be called a prank in its own right. The hand that was fiddling with the ends of her hair stopped as she considered that last thought. Now that she thought on it a bit more, there was no reason to be nervous about this. In fact, it might just be fun. Sensing the direction of her kits thinking, the kitsune gave the oblivious girl a small, proud smile that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. It is almost noon, Kit. If you want to be able to stop by Ichiraku's, you are going to have to hurry. At this the girl gave the kitsune a horrified look, her visible eye wide, and disappeared from the mindscape. Because of the time dilation the mindscape causes, the girl was already almost 9 years old, mentally at least. While it doesn't make such a big difference now, it will once she's a preteen and is attracted to men over twice her physical age. If she were to stay human, that might be a problem, but kitsune were very unconcerned when it came to the age, or even sex for that matter, of those they feel like staying with for a while. Because of their long lifespan and small numbers, no matter what they do, they're practically robbing the cradle. But they do so anyway, because no matter how long they might be able to survive alone, the Kyuubi had found that Nariko's survival instincts were especially strong and may just get stronger as she grew older. Kitsune were a very social people, they needed contact with others to keep them sane. By the time her mind and body mature enough for her to want that sort of thing, she'll have been a kitsune for quite a few years. Either way, she doubted that she'd ever grow out of that ramen obsession. It certainly didn't happen with either of her relatives, but one could always hope. Nariko opened her right eye and the cool blue iris regarded the glass ceiling for a moment, squinting through the trees at the bright sunlight that had somehow contrived to fall on her face, before she slowly sat up, knowing that moving too quickly on the hammock would simply cause it to capsize. Tying off the end of the braid with a black tie, she descended the staircase in the direction of her cloud room to get ready to go out. Ramen, here she comes. Stepping out of the tower, Nariko bent down to adjust her ninja sandals, the dark grey of the shoes matching her outfit perfectly. Fashion consciousness was one of the first things of the Kyuubi had taught her. The first lesson thereof: bright orange jumpsuits are not appropriate for clothing for 6-year-old girls. Or for anyone, really. Looking up, she judged it to be almost 12:30, leaving her enough time for a quick stop at Ichiraku's before she snuck into the Hokage tower. She crouched for a moment and then jumped into the trees. There were many ways to get in and out of the forest that were unknown and unusable to anyone not directly connected to the seal matrix or invited to use them by one who was. These included, but were not limited to, underground tunnels and teleportation seals. However, this comparatively normal way of doing things was by far her favorite. The forest itself called to something wild and primal deep within her, and she felt just as at home out here as she did safely ensconced in her tower. Hopping from one branch to another, sometimes griping tightly to the branches with chakra as she had learned to do with the tree climbing exercise, she sped through the forest and was out in the main village within 15 minutes. The girl quickly gained her bearings, but stuck to the rooftops in an effort to avoid the civilians. Suddenly, she dropped into a street that, while not as busy as the main market, was certainly far from deserted and, braid trailing behind her, disappeared into a small ramen stand. 15 minutes later she emerged from the stall, stretching slightly, and waving goodbye in response to the farewell I am called after her. She'd have loved to stick around and chat with her surrogate sister and uncle, but she had to get going. After the attack, she had been unable to visit the stand, and while the Hokage was quick to reassure them of her well-being, they had been worried. They were glad to see she was doing better, but they still weren't quite used to how calm and almost apathetic she had become about anything not having to do with ramen, and even then she was a lot more subdued, even if she ate just as much. While they couldn't really understand everything that she'd been through, they still provided the place where she could eat her favorite food and pretend she was just like anyone else, and she loved them for it. They also loved her, because who else eats more than 10 bowls every time she stops by? Nariko finished stretching with a lazy yawn and bounded back up to the high road of the city, quickly making her way towards the Hokage monument and the tower in front of it. When the Sandaime returned from yet another tedious meeting, he was shocked by the greeting that rang out from the chair behind his desk. "Hey, Sarujiji, do you think I could get one of these chairs for my tower? They're ridiculously comfortable." When he didn't reply, Nariko turned from where she was looking out at the monument and laughed at the dumbstruck expression on the old Hokage's face. Giving him a smirk, a mischievous look in her eye, the girl spoke up again, breaking the old man out of his shock. "If you don't close your mouth, a fly might fly in." The comment woke the third from his semi-trance of surprise, and he replied, giving the blonde a wry smile as he did so. "No, I think it's one of a kind. The only one I know of that even comes close is the one in the council room. Now, up, I want to be sitting down for whatever you came all this way to speak about." The girl, still small for her age, obeyed, hopping out of the chair and moving around to look over the unfamiliar room curiously. While she had snuck into the tower before, and this room once as a test run the night before, she hadn't really had much of a chance to look around. Before that fateful birthday, he had mostly been the one to visit her at the orphanage, and after she moved to the tower, he had always been the one to visit her when he had time. "Now, Nariko," he said, getting the blonde's attention, "how did you get in here?" "Not telling," she said with a smirk, and before he could protest the answer, she continued, "All I'm going to say is that the guards on this place are pathetic. They should be able to at least keep a 6-year-old girl out of your office." Sarutabi didn't really have anything to say to that. She was right after all, so he put that matter to the side for the moment. He gave voice to his other question though. "What did you want then, my dear? You wouldn't come all this way just to visit me when you know that I planned on coming to see you tomorrow." It was a valid point, so the girl climbed into one of the chairs facing the old man and got down to business. "I want to enter the academy this year." The third just blinked in surprise. "This early? But you're only 6!" he exclaimed. "Yes, I know," she replied, and then elaborated, "I know that you know that the Kyuubi has been helping me train myself." She ignored the old Hokage's uncomfortable shifting at the mention of the demon fox, "and that you also know something of what I'm now capable of. I don't want to hang around doing nothing but train myself and eat ramen for the next 4 years of my life. It'd get a bit more than boring after a while." The old man frowned a bit at that, and she hastily kept speaking, "I'm also more than capable of it, just the fact that I'm here should tell you that." As she pointed this out, she gestured around the room, and Sarutabi began to seriously consider what she was trying to tell him. "Just me being here tells you that I can safely navigate the forest without getting hurt or lost, and that I can easily sneak past Anbu-level guards." She trailed off before she started babbling and made things worse. As she fidgeted a little in her chair, a bit nervous despite her earlier reassurance, the old man regarded her with a thoughtful look. Most children entered the academy at the age of 8 and then graduated at the age of 12 4 years later. Any earlier generally had a detrimental effect on their mentality, as shown by the eccentricities of Maito Gai and Hate Kakashi. Even Uchiritachi had shown the effects of taking high-level missions too soon, even if it was more subtle. Such large obsessions with spandex, youth, porn, and Pocky were not normal no matter how you looked at it. And those were just the side effects. But despite this, he knew that regardless of his efforts, Nariko had already had a very hard life. The mask he briefly set his eyes on before looking away from guiltily really just emphasized that fact. Her behavior had changed drastically since the incident, and though he missed her optimistic cheerfulness, he knew that even back then when she smiled, she was more often than not forcing it. If she graduated early, and it was an all too real possibility given her recent rise in skill, he'd just have to keep her to missions ranked lower than B as much as possible. Perhaps keeping her as a genin until she reached the same age as an academy graduate? If he switched out her team every so often, it would give her plenty of experience with working with different personalities and group sizes. He supposed he could work out the details later. Shaking his head of the speculative thoughts that were beginning to run rampant, he turned his attention back to where the 6-year-old had been sitting. He was surprised to see an empty chair. He hadn't even sensed her moving. Turning to look around the room, he was surprised to see his surrogate granddaughter staring up at the serious picture of his predecessor. The conflicting emotions in her visible eye caused a saddened look to briefly run across his face before he spoke, distracting her from her thoughts. "Well, I can't really see anything wrong with it when you put it like that, but I don't want you taking too many high-ranked missions until you're at least 12 or 13. When she made as if to protest the decision, he explained the reasons, the horror on her face at the thought of turning into a female version of Mito Gari, whom she had had the dubious pleasure of meeting while making a discreet retreat from one of the sites of her bigger pranks, told him that she probably wouldn't push the boundaries on that too much. They talked about the arrangements for the coming school year and other more mundane things for a while before the old man realized that he had far too much work to do if he wanted to be able to visit her tomorrow. Seeing that he had a point when he pointed this out to her, Nariko made to leave through the window when she suddenly remembered something. Turning around with an expression that looked absurdly menacing on the face of a 6-year-old girl, a shiver worked its way down Sarutabi's spine. "Oh, and Sarujiji, if I ever catch you reading that little orange porn book I found in your desk around me, you'll wish you were the Hyuga elders last Friday." With that ultimatum, the third was left to stare in shock at the window the girl had disappeared through. Then he groaned. He should have known who was playing all those pranks without even having to think about it. Then the threat registered and he slumped down in his chair with a soft whimper, holding the top of his head in an almost protective hold as he did so. He really liked what was left of his hair where it was. He recalled the results of that particular prank. The calls for the prankster's death were quite loud and strident for a clan that had always prided itself on its stoicism. Giving a sigh, he was almost relieved that he had capitulated when he did. Anyone who could shave the heads of every Hyuga elder as they slept, as well as painting the entire compound an eye-searing orange all in the same night, and to get away with it so completely he didn't want to think about what she might have done to him had he refused. He whimpered again. For years later, Sarutabi Hiruzen looked over the sheets of paper that illustrated this year's academy graduates, the teacher's evaluation of them and the recommended teams for their placement. Unsurprisingly, his favorite blonde had placed first in her year. What was a bit surprising was that she had done it without showing anything more than the most minor of her skill set, in other words, what she considered the mere basics. How she was able to maintain such a high grade point average and pull off more massive and increasingly more elaborate pranks was still a mystery to him. There was still a problem though. Nariko had not made a single close friend throughout her time at the academy. He had hoped that being around children close to her own age would help to alleviate some of the increasing loneliness and isolation he had detected in her demeanor all those years ago. He was wrong. Even though she still had the majority of the shinobi support, in fact with her inclusion in the academy the amount of her support there had dramatically increased as well, nothing could be done about the civilians' prejudice. They would tell their children to stay away from the child with dire warnings of what might happen to them if they didn't. The children would then pass the warning on to their friends among the children from shinobi clans. Even though they attempted to reassure their children that there was no danger in hanging around Nariko, that it might even be advisable to do so, the peer pressure proved to be too much. Though the young girl wasn't outright shunned, there were still all too few that wished to play with her for any amount of time if they could help it. Eventually Nariko got used to it, but the Sandame found that the most heartbreaking part of all of it, that it was something that she had to get used to at all, was almost unforgivable. But as was the original point, such behavior didn't exactly allow her to form bonds with any of the other members of the class, and with the odd number of students passing this year's exam, there was no logical place to put her. He reconsidered what he had first thought about when the small girl child had first asked him if she could enter the academy early. He didn't want to give her a permanent team just yet anyway, so this worked out fairly well. Until her 12th year she would be a floating genin. She would assist on missions that required more than a genin team but not a full team in assistance. She would be able to take everything from low B ranks, of course with a team on the higher ranked ones, down to build her experience, and when a suitable team emerged from the academy he would assign her a permanent team to take the Chunan exams with before her 13th birthday. Writing down the details of his plan, he hoped that the girl would appreciate the effort he was going through for this. After all, he was the only one who knew that at the age of 10 she was fast approaching low Jounin level in skill. 2 years later, it was a dream. Nariko knew it was a dream. In fact, it was one she had quite frequently over the last several years. Even as the memories compounded themselves and spread across her subconscious mind, she knew it was a dream. But that didn't stop her from being afraid. Because no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't wake up, and as the flames licked around her feet she knew this was a nightmare. She was running. From what and to where she didn't know. But she was terrified and small and weak, something she had sworn to herself to never be again. And she kept on running, the terror she knew so well pushing her ever onwards. Then she tripped and fell, and suddenly she was surrounded by what she had been running from. As they closed around her, and she looked up at the blank black faces and evil white grins, she couldn't help but wonder why she had bothered to run at all. They stretched clawed mockeries of hands towards her, and just as they might have touched her, and she opened her mouth to scream, she was falling. Not just falling, but falling. Falling, falling, falling. And with a thud she landed spread-eagled on the ground. Glancing around frantically, she recognized where she was Anne, the weight of a grown man's body pinning her to the ground as something sharp and pointy that hurt, drove through small hands, pinning them to the floor, and the pain went on and on and on. Reliving the pain she had felt so long ago, she opened her mouth to scream, but what came out was a voice that wasn't entirely her own, Kyuubi. And everything around her went up in frantic flames that reacted to her panic and spread, engulfing everything she could still see. She closed her eye against glare. On opening the eye, she was startled to see she was no longer in the burning apartment she remembered so well, even after all these years, but on top of the Hokud monument, facing the trees behind it. Feeling something drip down the side of her face that was normally covered by her mask, she raised a trembling hand to it. The scars on her face that she knew should be long since healed were open and bleeding. Her right eye widened in shock. She clenched her hand, one that was still small and delicate despite all of her training, and didn't even notice the small tear that trailed from her working eye. Then suddenly there was a shadowed figure in front of her, and still holding her hand against her eye, she snarled out, "Who are you?" The figure, one that towered above her own still small stature, didn't reply immediately, but when it did, it completely ignored her question. "It's your fault, isn't it?" was all he said, in a mournful tone. Confused, she just stared blankly at the shadow. "What's my fault?" she asked warily. The man didn't speak again, and the voice he had spoken with sounded awfully familiar, but pointed over her shoulder, behind her and down towards the village. Her right eye widened, and she tried with everything in her body not to turn herself around, but as if to spite her normally exquisite control of her body, she turned nonetheless. She stared in horrified shock as the village she loved beyond almost anything else burned before her. The blue-white flames of what she recognized as foxfire stretched to unimaginable highs as they fed on the wooden bones of what had been the strongest hidden village in the elemental countries. Frozen in an awful combination of horror and terror and awe, she was unable to even collapse to her knees before her destroyed home. The familiar voice of the shadowed stranger echoed around her with a tone of unfathomable sadness as the flames began to lick around her feet. "So, it's your fault after all then, Naruto." Just as she tilted her head back to scream in grief, she woke up. Sitting up with a jerk and a gasp, she immediately raised her hand to the left side of her face and let out a sigh of relief at the familiar feel of the scars beneath her fingers. So, it was that dream again then, she thought. Relaxing a bit, but still breathing hard, she ran the same hand through the soft cascade of her hair, pulling it over the marks that marred the majority of her face to pool in her lap. Sighing again, she turned to the digital clock that sat on the small table beside her bed and groaned at the time. 4:30 in the morning was not her preferred time to rise and meet the day. In fact, when she didn't have nightmares, she loved sleeping and slept whenever and wherever she got the chance. Naruto had often compared her to the Nora when he learned of this habit of hers. Seeing no point in going back to sleep now, though, she rose and made her way in a zombie-like fashion to the bathroom that connected to the master bedroom, her hair trailing on the floor behind her. On that day, over 6 years ago now, when she had first slept in the tower, she had claimed the cloud room for herself. However, that simply decorated room that she had felt so safe in wasn't actually the master bedroom. She had known this though, and when she finally became a genin 2 years ago, she had moved herself to the room she now inhabited. The real master bedroom was decorated with a mix of silver and pale blue, giving the place the feeling of ice and water and snow. It was actually very soothing. The main part of the room was at least twice the size of the cloud room and contained an emperor bed, in contrast to the queen-sized one of her previous room. The bed itself was more like a giant futon raised onto a platform, and soft white sheets covered it like a blanket of snow. Along with the snowflake wallpaper, it reminded her of her mindscape and made her feel very comfortable. The soft plush carpets that covered the floor of the room were the same white color as the sheets, but were randomly interspersed with soft splashes of different shades of blue. The accents of the room, such as lampshades, door handles, were in soft shades of blue as well. The room itself had a wedge shape that came from where it was positioned. The whole back wall of the room was the outside wall of the tower and was covered with random and wide windows that gave an awe-inspiring view of the forest. On the 2 sides of the wedge were the walk-in closet and the bathroom she had just entered. The bathroom was a massive structure that was more like a hot spring than anything else. Along the side of the wall that held the door that opened onto the bedroom was a long counter made of an ice-white marble that complemented the color scheme of the master bedroom. It contained 3 sinks and held all of the grooming supplies that a girl, or even 3 girls for that matter, could ever need, from makeup to hair curlers and a straightening iron. Above the counter, a long, high-quality mirror reflected the rest of the room and the tired form of still-waking Kunoichi. The tiled floor of the bathing room was a mix of icy swirls that tilted down on a slight incline towards a drain. On the other side of the long room, a truly massive bathtub was sunk into the floor. It resembled a small swimming pool more than anything else, and smooth waterproof cushions covered the edges as well as the sides and bottom of the tub, making it an excellent place to relax. With a snap of her fingers, Noriko had the hot water pouring into a large tub, but she herself made her way towards the shower stall at the end of the room. 10 minutes later she got out of the shower, and after squeezing the excess water out of the ridiculously long strands of her hair, she pinned them above her head with a large clip she grabbed off of the counter. She then made her way over to the steaming bath and sank down into the hot water with a soft sigh, leaning her head back against the cushions in contentment. An hour later, Noriko, feeling completely refreshed and awake, emerged from the bathroom wrapped in a thick white yukata that hung off one of her shoulders loosely. Shrugging the robe-like garment back onto her shoulder, she secured the garment about her waist with a sash and opened the door of the walk-in closet on the other side of the room. The walk-in closet was one of the things that showed that this house had mostly been inhabited by women, and powerful women at that. In fact, it almost couldn't be qualified as a closet. It was more like a private mall. If it weren't for storage and space seals, the amount of clothing in the place would take up almost 2 floors of the tower. It had every kind of clothing or costume you could ever want or need, and was periodically updated every few months with the latest fashions and non-fashions, in every size and for every gender that you could ever imagine, by automated seals. It was due to this closet that Noriko never had to worry about clothes shopping again. Considering how the villagers treated her, she wouldn't have been surprised if she had been forced to wear something of the likes of that awful orange jumpsuit again. Closing the door behind her, she went to choose her outfit for the day. Observing the racks of clothes and shoes and scrolls, she sighed. This might take a while. It was another hour until she finally was ready to go and prepared to leave the tower. As she pulled on her shoes, she looked at the clock and realized that it was almost 8 o'clock. She knew that if she didn't move fast, she wouldn't make it to her appointment with Gigi at said time. Sitting up, she put her hands together under the long sleeves of the outfit she had finally decided on to form the seals of a jutsu she had conned out of one of the older jounin. With a light puff of smoke, she disappeared from the room. Sarutobi glanced around the room as he waited for the arrival of one of his most promising genin. In the 2 years since she had graduated, Noriko had progressed in leaps and bounds. He knew that it would be impossible to give her the title of anything but genius. Graduating early was one thing, especially when you entered early in the first place, but to complete any mission from D to mid-B rank with an almost flawless record had turned a lot more heads. He knew that in order for her to go to the Chunan exams this year, and she would have to, with the pressure from the new council to promote her, she would need the best of the class. That meant the Rookie of the Year, Ucha Sasuke, would be put on her team. He had a few reservations about that, but because it was only based on what he had gleaned of Noriko's opinion over the last Ucha, as the civilians called him, it didn't really hold much weight, especially since it had become much harder to read what Noriko was really thinking over that last few years. The other would have to be able to work around the personalities of the other 2 members of the squad and be able to think on his feet almost as fast as Noriko can, otherwise he wouldn't be able to keep up. The only ones he could see who might fit that role would be Aburame Shino and Noroshi Kamaru. The Aburame, however, had already been requested by Yuhi Kurenai to form a tracking team with the Hyuga and the Inuzuka. With the Noros just barely passing grades, it would be easy to put him on the same team as the Rookie of the Year if it weren't for the original Ino Shikacho trio pushing for a reformation with their children taking their spots. However, after some careful and discreet observation, it quickly became apparent that despite Shikamaru and Chuji's long-standing friendship, they found it hard to get along with Ino's bossy and fangirlish attitude. It was eventually decided that a team consisting of Ucha Sasuke, Noroshi Kamaru, and Uzumaki Noriko held the most potential, even if the odds were stacked in their favor. If they did this, however, they were going to need to do something about the last team. Having Ino and Sakura on the same team was clearly a disaster waiting to happen. They eventually decided to switch out the Hyuga with the Haruno with the hopes that Yuhi might be able to turn the Pinkette into a decent Kunoichi, especially with her promise in Genjutsu. Hinata would be placed on Team 10 with the Akimichi and the Yamanoka in the hopes that being around a more confident girl like Ino would help to shore up the heiress' confidence. Despite Kurenai's wishes, he knew what could happen if a team was too specialized and the young jounin needed to get over her failure with Yakumo. Perhaps breaking in a young fangirl Kunoichi could help her with that. He was pulled from his thoughts by the puff of white smoke that heralded the arrival of his favorite blonde who, with a silent nod of greeting, sat on the chair in front of his desk and crossed her legs in front of herself. However, before he began to speak, he took a double take at what the genin was wearing. Her legs were covered only by long stockings made of a dense mesh fishnet and her feet by high-heeled ninja sandals much like those his former student, Tsuneade, wore, except in a dark purple color. Over them she wore a loose yukata much like her old one, except this was in a deep elegant royal purple with icy blue accents. The bottom of it flared away from her legs, baring them to the world, but hiding anything too private, and ending over a foot above her ankles. The upper part of the causal kimono was bound with a wide obi that ended right beneath her, not inconsiderable for her age, chest. The shoulders of the garment hung stylishly off her shoulders, leaving only her long hair to cover them. The sleeves themselves were long enough to cover her hands, and then some, hiding the ever-present gloves that Sarutobi knew would be there. Her half-mask was there, much as it always was, though this one was the same icy blue as the accents on her yukata. Her hair, bright as ever in the slightly darkened room, shone from where it was gathered into a loose bun on top of her head and secured with a few ornamental hair pins he was sure were probably senbon. Long locks of hair that when compared with the rest of it might even qualify as bangs framed her face and hung in front of her shoulders, obscuring them from view. He knew that she loved to get a reaction from people, but this was a little much, even for her. He supposed she wanted to provoke an interesting one from her new teammates. He sighed as he raised an exasperated eyebrow at the preteen in front of him. He knew very well by now that most of what she was wearing was probably almost indestructible or could be used as a weapon despite its beauty, but he still couldn't help but stare every time he saw her like this. She gave a light cough to shake him out of his slight trance, and her gave slight shake of his head and turned his attention to briefing Nariko on what she could expect from her new teammates. 15 minutes later found her staring at the building she had graduated from 2 years ago. A sad glint appeared in her eye as she caught sight of the wooden swing that hung from the branch of a tree in the main courtyard. She remembered claiming that swing as her own on her first day as she, surrounded by new friends, chatted and smiled, dodging questions about her mask the whole time. The next day, though, over half of her new friends were avoiding her, and over the next few weeks the rest were convinced to abandon her as well. By the next month she was left stare out across the playing children that almost immediately abandoned any game she attempted to join them in. Quickly noticing the glares of the civilian adults when they came to pick up their children, she deduced what had happened. Peer pressure was a horrible thing, and she couldn't really blame the children. She blamed the parents. Over the next year or so she had resigned herself to a lonely school life, and when she found the Koge Bunshin Jutsu in the tower library she had never been so grateful. From that point on she had sent a Bunshin reinforced with her Kitsune chakra to class and spent her time on other, better, things. Feeling nostalgic, Nariko-chan? The familiar voice that echoed from the depths of her consciousness broke her out of her remembrance of the years she had spent here. Her face immediately lost its sad look. No. Shaking her head as if to rid it of the memories, she continued her leisurely walk to the building. Meanwhile, inside the building, Iruka stood in front of the podium in his classroom, eyebrow twitching as the majority of the excited class in front of him chattered on, oblivious to his darkening mood. Why did I take this job again? Oh yeah, because the pay's good and I just love children. Giving a mental sigh at his sarcastic thoughts, he returned his attention to the mob of children in front of him. Shut up, you brats! The effects of his widely known and feared, at least in the academy, demon head jutsu rocked through the room. As if by magic all of the newly graduated genin were quietly sitting in their seats with a slightly shell-shocked look. With a slight smile he began the speech he gave to every one of his graduating classes. Congratulations to all of you who have managed to make it this far. However, the road ahead of you will only get harder from this point on. You are now genin, the lowest of the low, and as such adults. I'm proud of you all for making it this far, and I wish you luck on the journey ahead of you. If you remember nothing else, remember this: you now represent our village, the oldest and strongest of all shinobi villages. Take pride in that. As Iruka finished his speech, several cheers sounded throughout the room from the more exuberant students. After they died down, however, Iruka was quick to speak up once more. Now then, as per tradition, you have been divided into teams of 3 along with a jounin instructor. Team 1, he began to list the names of the teams and their members. Then he got to Team 7. Team 7, jounin instructor, Hatake Kakashi. Members, Acha Sasuke. At this name quite a few of the girls in the class, including Haruno Sakura and Yamanoka Aino, leaned forward in anticipation, sure that they would be paired with their true love. Iruka, however, ignored this and continued, Noro Shikamaru. At his name Shikamaru raised his head from where he had been pretending to sleep in surprise. He had thought he would be placed with Chuji. He gave a sigh and thought, well, even if he is troublesome, at least he's not Aino. Sasuke had similar thoughts, though his were more in the range of all his fangirls. And he was cut off both by his own shock at the name and the door of the classroom sliding open. The girl framed by the door was quite familiar, even if what she was wearing wasn't. and Uzumaki Noriko." He finished, giving the girl a nod. She gave him a smirk and spoke, "Well, you're as stiff as ever, aren't you, Scar-sensei?" She stepped into the room, giving everyone there a good view of her. He just sighed at the familiar nickname and replied, "What are you wearing, Noriko?" "Oh, this?" she said, twirling, the sleeves and bottom of her yukata spreading around her as she did so. She stopped after a single rotation to reply, "Just something I threw on this morning." He sighed again at the girl's familiar antics. "Well, go sit with one of your new teammates, I suppose. I'll have to talk with you after I finish assigning the teams." She turned to do just that when she finally noticed the reactions of the rest of the class to her sudden appearance. The females in the room, aside from the ever-shy Hinata, were glaring at her with repressed killing intent and jealously. Most of the males were either drooling slightly or staring with unabashed shock. In fact, the only reaction she couldn't judge with a glance was that of the Aburame. "Who the hell are you?" The question erupted in a screechy soprano from the throat of one Haruno Sakura as she seethed in jealousy. Who was this bitch that stole her place on her Sasuke-kun's team? The same sentiments were quickly echoed by the rest of the females, aside from Hinata of course, in the room. Noriko's visible eyebrow twitched in irritation at the high-pitched screech. She took one look at the pinkette and came to an obvious conclusion. "A fangirl. I'm Uzumaki Noriko," she said. "And you, fangirls that you are, clearly shame the name of every serious kunoichi that has ever graduated from this academy. I hope you're proud of yourselves." She finished, punctuating her last statement with a small dose of killer intent and scorn. The rest of the class could only gape at her as she, smirking again in satisfaction at the shocked looks, strode up the raised bleacher-like desks to sit on the same row as Uchiha Sasuke. Shikamaru's first impression of his new teammate was something he had never thought of a girl before. Beautiful, then he shook off the effect of her appearance to discreetly analyze her as a shinobi. Her movements were precise and balanced, carrying the grace only archived by one highly trained in taijutsu and the ninja arts. As she moved, despite her high heels, she didn't make a sound. Her appearance carried with it a weight he had only felt once before, in the presence of the Hokage. When he had later asked his father about it, he had said that that kind of feeling hung only around those of truly immense chakra capacity. It was like your instincts flashing a dangerous sign over their head, because anyone with that much chakra was, or had the potential to be, truly dangerous. Her outfit, while flashy, was also clearly designed to allow easy movement, and he had no doubt that she had many weapons hidden about her person. He came to the conclusion that this young girl, clearly his own age, maybe even younger, was far more skilled than the Chunan she had just finished speaking with. As he watched her chew out the girls of his graduating class with a few pointed sentences, he could only come to one conclusion. This girl is going to be troublesome. Uchiha Sasuke had never been even remotely attracted to anyone of the female gender. Before the massacre he had simply been too young. After said disaster he had been far too focused on achieving his revenge against his traitorous elder brother. That changed the moment Uzumaki Noriko stepped into the room. Long golden hair piled onto her head in a deliberately messy fashion. A single amused blue eye taking in everything with a glance. The elegant twirl showing off her strong and graceful limbs. He could tell that she was not a fangirl. She was a kunoichi. And she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When she made her way up to sit at the same desk as him he could barely breathe, and when she turned to give him a winking greeting he felt his heart stop for a second before racing again. He had to look down at his desk to gather his composure before nodding in reply. This girl, she was different. When she had caught sight of him, a flash of something familiar in her demeanor caught his attention, something he knew he should recognize. It wasn't until she had left to talk to Iruka that he finally recognized it as the loneliness he had felt so often since the night his clan had been eradicated. What he couldn't figure out though was why someone as stunning as her would know the taste of something like that. And he would do everything in his power to figure out how and why. During the team assignments, in the Hokage's office, the Hokage looked around at the gathered jounin and smiled as Kakashi arrived with an excuse on his lips. "No need for excuses, Kakashi. I told you the meeting was 2 hours earlier than it actually was, so you're just on time." He ignored what could have been a pout and turned to the rest of the jounin. Still smiling, he pulled out his crystal ball, beckoned them to come closer. "Now, let's take a look at your future students, shall we?" The jounin gathered close and leaned over the orb as the image of a classroom appeared in it. They watched as Iruka gave his customary speech and listed off the first few generic teams that they all knew would probably fail. Then he came to Team 7 and Kakashi leaned in a bit closer at the sound of his name. He already knew a bit about his new subordinates, but he hadn't had the time to see them personally. The first two had relatively neutral reactions to learning they would be on the same team, giving him hope that teaching them proper teamwork wouldn't be too hard. The entrance of the last member shocked him into a stunned silence though. The name and her coloring were unmistakable, but the young woman framed in the orb was completely different from the child he used to guard from harm so long ago. What shocked him the most though was how pretty the girl was. In a few years she'd be a complete knockout. However, the cold shinobi part of him couldn't help but notice the way she moved, and the scolding she gave the females of the class only solidified it in his mind. This was a serious and skilled kunoichi. But still, he wondered, just what can I teach this girl? He pretty much ignored the rest of the team assignments, though the pink-haired girl's strident objections to being on the same squad as the Aburame and the Inuzuka made him wince in sympathy for the recently promoted jounin in charge of them. As soon as the Sandame dismissed the meeting, he disappeared in a small puff of smoke, his mind racing a mile a minute. Eventually, he decided to treat them as he would any other team, at least until they proved themselves different from the rest. He had the strange feeling that it wouldn't take too long. Yumino Iruka was a very kind man. But it was undeniable that he was also a straight-laced stiff that didn't know how to flirt worth a damn. It was partly because of this that Nariko enjoyed teasing him so much. So, Scar-sensei, she trailed off as she leaned closer and stared up at him through dark lashes, a teasing glint apparent in her eye. Iruka blushed and turned his head away from her as he sat in the stiff chair behind his desk in the small office off of his classroom. Refusing to make eye contact with her, he sighed and took the bait. What, Nariko? She pouted and abruptly changed the topic. How many times have I told you to call me Nariko-chan, sensei? At least one more time, Nariko. Normally he wouldn't have any problem using such a familiar suffix with a former student, but he knew that if he conceded to Nariko's request, she might go far enough to try and make him do something far more embarrassing, like get drunk. She knew just as well as he did that he was a lightweight when it came to alcohol, but that just made it all the more fun for her. Theirs was a strange relationship. When Nariko had first entered the academy 6 years ago, Iruka only knew as much about her as the average Chunan-level shinobi. She was a Jinchu Uriki, and he should be respectful and kind should he ever meet her. It wasn't until 2 years later that they began to get to know each other beyond a sort of distant student-teacher relationship. It was then that he had heard about a good ramen shop just off the market district and went there for a bite to eat on his break. When he entered the shop, he was surprised to find the normally almost mute blonde chatting with a waitress and devouring bowl after bowl of ramen. In fact, he was more surprised to see her speaking amiably with any civilian at all. He had been under the impression that the majority of the civilian population disliked her, and even those that didn't avoided her on a regular basis. He watched the two females chatter about incomprehensible female things for the better part of an hour as he slowly ate his ramen. His curiosity about his student pricked. After she left, he stared a conversation about her with the pretty young waitress. He learned quite a few things about her from the waitress and left with a warning to never get on her bad side ringing in his ears. Who would have thought that the famous mysterious prankster was actually Nariko? However, it wasn't until he found her being ridiculed by several nasty housewives that they began to get at all close. He had stopped by the market on his way home from the academy to pick up something for dinner when he caught sight of the incident. Nariko had been attempting to buy a few large bags of rice from the teller, and behind her, clearly within earshot, several middle-aged women were snidely insulting her in rather loud voices. With every shot they took at her, he could see her tensing against the verbal blows. It wasn't until he caught sight of her face, though, that he stepped in. Her face, what he could see of it at least, was blanked of emotion, and her visible eyes showed her struggling to suppress them. A deep anger, unfathomable loneliness, and an unbearable sadness that mirrored what he could so vividly remember of his own time alone after the Kyuubi attack were more than apparent. But it was the slightly trembling hands that were so carefully packing away her purchases that really got to him. He can't remember exactly what he had said, but he recalled scolding them like they were school children, except in harsher language. He had then paid for his own stuff and, under the astonished eyes of everyone there, including Nariko, helped the girl bag her things and then dragged her out of the store. Their short conversation after that he can remember as clearly as if it were yesterday, though. Flashback. Once they got a decent distance from the store, Iruka paused for a moment to catch his breath. Nariko took the opportunity to remove her wrist from his grip. He watched as she lightly rubbed the place his hand had griped her, as if to check for injury, with an inscrutable expression on his face. She muttered something under her breath at him. "What was that, Nariko?" he asked. She gave a soft sigh and spoke up. "Why did you do that, Iruka-sensei?" The question somehow managed to come out sounding like a statement. "You mean defending you or tugging you out of the store?" She frowned a bit and dropped her hands to lie against her sides. "Both." Despite the shinobi's quiet support of her, no one except the Hokage and the Ikirakas had ever defended her in such a way, and she barely even knew the academy instructor. He frowned and looked away from her with a slight flush across his cheekbones, hinting at his belated embarrassment at his outburst. Well, I wasn't really thinking about what I was doing. You kind of remind me of how I was when I was younger, and I guess what those old biddies were doing kind of set me off. After that I just wanted to get out of there, but I wasn't about to leave you behind by yourself, so he trailed off as he began to babble and tried to judge what she was thinking. Oh, she said softly. She had suspected that he might have done it under orders or something, but that he would defend her without even really knowing her all by himself, it kind of embarrassed her and made her feel warm deep in her chest at the same time. She flushed lightly, and with a small smile the child looked up at him with a soft expression that rarely crossed her face. Iruka himself was shocked at the raw emotion there. "Thank you," was all she said, but the gratitude and awe at such a simple action was more than apparent. Yumino Iruka had just made it onto Noriko's very short list of precious people. It proved to be a good choice on her part. Flashback end. After that they had slowly gotten closer, and soon Noriko saw him as the big brother she'd never had. Iruka himself found that she was actually far more exuberant than she displayed in class. Often he would tell her of his own pranking exploits as a child, and saw the results in a few eerily familiar pranks played on the market district. He doubted the neon purple paint would ever come out. He had watched on with amusement and pride as she grew up, and despaired at some of her more excessive antics. When she had graduated at the top of her class 2 years later, he couldn't have been prouder. As a graduating gift to herself, she had ousted herself as the mysterious prankster by allowing herself to be caught with evidence after she finished her decoration of the Hokage monument. After that, though, she had started missions and only played pranks to discreetly get back at those that angered her. Though he didn't know it, it was his influence and attention that had finally given her the confidence to let out the social kitsune nature that had been bubbling beneath her stoic surface. For that she had sworn to always protect him, and as a result, when Mizuki betrayed the village a year or so later and somehow ended up attacking Iruka, there wasn't much left of him to be found afterwards. Lately, though, she had been practicing her flirting tactics on him and counted every blush as a success. She had yet to tell him this, though, and his confusion only added to her enjoyment of the exercise. He tried to return to what they were originally talking about before Noriko tried to get him to blush. "Now, what do you think of your teammates?" She gave him an unreadable half-lidded look, then sighed and looked away. As she thought on his question, she retreated to the small window that looked over the front courtyard of the academy. She caught sight of the swing again, and frowned before turning around to face him again. With her back to the sunlight, she became a mere shadow, framed by the sun. Then she leaned back on the window sill and replied, "The Noro seems to be much like any of his clan, lazy but intelligent. His analytical skills may be above even their average, though. He knew that I was far more skilled than any genin should be without even speaking to me." She then paused for a second before tilting her head away and continuing. "The Archer, well, he seems like he broods too much, and just by his reaction when I winked at him, he may be developing a small crush on me. I'll reserve any further judgment until I get to know them better," she said diplomatically. He nodded in agreement at her assessment and then glanced at the clock. "We'd better get going. The Jounin sensei should be arriving soon." She looked at the time herself and agreed, though with her sensei she may just have to wait a few hours anyway. As she had thought, it was hours before her new sensei arrived. The other senseis had come within minutes of the end of the break to gather their new students. After half an hour of waiting, with the 3 remaining genin, Iruka had had to leave as well. The 3, left to their own devices, soon occupied themselves with other things. Sasuke divided his time between reading a technique scroll he had brought along and watching Noriko. Shikamaru, finding waiting to be troublesome, fell asleep. Noriko herself had nothing to do either and soon followed her teammate into slumber. She almost immediately woke again in her mindscape. Over the course of the years, the basic structure of the mind plane hadn't changed much from her original modifications. Snow still covered the ground in an endless blanket of white. The white flum still fell from a clear blue sky, and the forest of her subconscious was as dark as ever, but beneath the massive cherry tree a small place to rest had been laid out. A soft green carpet rested on top of the snow, and on the soft plush 2 white lounging chaises faced each other over a low wooden tea table. Around the resting area 10 small balls of foxfire hovered, casting conflicting and mysterious shadows over everything. They had first appeared after Noriko had gained her first tail, though at that time they had all consisted of a dull see-through white color. The Kyuubi had told her that each one represented one of her tail's essences. Each tail represented a certain element. The first 5 embodied the 5 earthly elements, water, fire, earth, air, and lightning. As a result, any tailed kitsune was a master, or at least a user, of at least one element. A true five-tailed kitsune is one that has mastered all five of the earthly elements and can use them both interchangeably and together in combined elements such as wood, ice, or lava. While not as powerful as a kitsune with more tails, the sheer amount of techniques available to their use makes them very versatile. Nariko had only recently mastered her fifth tail in the past few months and was now working on combined elements with the assistance of numerous Kogebunshin. The first tail had been transferred a month after she had first entered the academy. To smooth the transition, the BU had chosen to transfer the tail of Nariko's natural earthly element, air, or wind. The transfer had gone very smoothly and much better than expected in the fox's opinion, though Nariko would disagree. As the kitsune had warned her when they had first made their deal, it hurt a lot. When Nariko had begun to scream, the 9 tails, now 8 tails, had reflected that having your chakra system ripped apart and then put back together in a different way as your body and soul fought against changing species must be quite painful. The successive tails didn't hurt as much though, because she was already a kitsune. Over her years at the academy, she had slowly achieved and mastered a tail's power every year. The first was devoted to the air tail, the second to the earth, the third to the lightning, and so on. She mastered the tail of water just after graduation, but because it was her weakest natural element, it took her over a year and a half to finally perfect her use of the fire tail. She was now sufficiently occupied with learning to combine her 2 strongest elements, wind and water, to last her a month or so, even with shadow clones helping her out. She wanted to be ready for the 6th tail by the end of the year though, so even that was an estimate. As a result, every other orb of fire glowed brightly with a different color. Wind was a pale silver gray, earth a dark, soft brown, lightning was a bright, crackling yellow, water a deep, flowing blue, and fire was a burnt orange red that seemed as if it was just waiting to set something aflame. A faint line of light had begun to form between the water and wind flames, displaying the result of her efforts to utilize the two together. As had happened ever since she had set up the area in her mind, when she woke she was lying on one of the chaises, facing where the former BU was sipping at a small cup of tea. Now that Nariko was working on her mastery of her 5 tails, the former Kyuubi only had 4 tails to work with, making her technically less powerful than her daughter. Of course, her millennia of experience and endless chakra reserves served her well, and she still won the majority of their spars. Still, Nariko's progress was both astonishing and awe-inspiring to her. It sometimes took kitsune centuries to reach Nariko's current level of power. Either way though, with Nariko's latest increase in power, she had more tails than she herself did. As a gift and out of the trust that had sprung up between the two over the years, she had given Nariko her true name. Everything in the world had a true name, one that detonates every they have ever and will ever be given to them by the gods at their birth. This name is virtually unpronounceable and gives the person who knows it the authority of a god over the name's bearer, should they choose to use it. Nariko, of course, would never use it on one who had given her such trust, but by giving her name to Nariko, the fox had given Nariko seniority over herself and would have to obey any direct order given to her by the young girl. The two, however, were closer than ever before though, and Nariko had given the fox spirit a use name for everyday conversations such as this one. She had decided to call her Arisa. "Sleeping again, are we?" commented said kitsune. Nariko gave a noncommittal grunt of agreement and opened her eye to glaze over at her foster mother. "Yeah. Kakashi seems to be as late as the rumors say he always is, and I was getting bored." Arisa gave a small smile at that. "Did you just come in here to pass the time then?" "Yes," she said bluntly. "I even set it up so time would go faster in here." The woman raised an eyebrow at that. "You really must be bored then." She looked at the younger female with a contemplative expression for a moment before continuing. "Do you have time to play me a song?" she asked. A few years ago, before Nariko became close to Iruka, Arisa had noticed that just about all Nariko did in her free time was train and eat ramen. Being so completely shunned by children her own age had gotten to her more than it might have seemed, and bottling up so many negative feelings like that couldn't be good for anyone. So, the fox had suggested the girl take up a hobby. After trying a few things, Nariko had eventually settled on music, and so, every so often, while her clones continued to slave away in the training rooms, Nariko would go up to her greenhouse retreat and just play, releasing her stress. The exercise soon turned into one she enjoyed, and she began writing her own songs. Much to Arisa's enjoyment, the music she composed was actually really good. Nariko sighed at the other kitsune's subtly eager expression and materialized an acoustic guitar. "All right, what would you like to hear?" Arisa thought for a moment before replying. "I like that landslide one," she mused. Landslide it is then. The girl said with finality, and sitting up into a cross-legged position, she rested the instrument on her knees and began to play, and then sing, her voice staring off softly and then gaining confidence. I took my love and I took you down, climbed a mountain and I turned around, and I saw my reflection in the snow-covered hills. Well, the landslide brought me down. Oh, mirror in the sky, what is love? Can the child within my heart rise above? Can I sail through the changing ocean tides? Can I handle the seasons of my life? Oh, 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 tilde. Well, I've been afraid of Changjin, 'cause I've built my life around you. But time makes you bolder, and children get older, and I'm getting older too. Well, tilde. Well, I've been afraid of Changjin, 'cause I've built my life around you. But time makes you bolder, and children get older, and I'm getting older too, tilde. Well, I'm getting older too. So tilde, take this love, and take me down. Yeah, tilde. And if you climb a mountain and you turn around, and if you see my reflection in the snow-covered hills, well, the landslide brought me down. And if you see my reflection in the snow-covered hills, well, maybe tilde, well, maybe tilde, well, may be tilde, the landslide'll bring you down asterisk. As the playing trailed off, Nariko opened the eye she had closed when she began singing. Arisa smiled at her and softly complimented her, beautiful as always, Nariko-chan. Nariko gave her a shy smile in return and loosened her grip on the guitar to reach up and fiddle with a stray strand of hair. Arisa was the only person she had ever played for, and any compliment the kitsune gave her on her music was greatly appreciated, even if they kind of embarrassed her. Then the girl suddenly jerked her head up and vanished from the mindscape. It seemed Hatake Kakashi had finally arrived. Nariko woke up and raised her head from where it had been resting in the crook of her elbow to glance at the clock. It seemed that 2 hours had passed since she had managed to doze off. She leaned over to poke her slumbering teammate awake and then turned her attention to the door of the classroom. The two boys stared confusedly at her for a moment before turning to look at the door as well, and just in time to see their new sensei slide it open. He was a relatively tall man, around 5 feet 10 inches, and the impression of height was only furthered by the gravity-defying silver hair that stood out at a slight angle from his head. The bottom half of his face was covered by a blue fabric face mask, and his hitayate was slanted to cover his left eye, leaving only his right eye and the area around it visible. The rest of his outfit consisted of plain shinobi pants, a long-sleeved shirt, black shinobi sandals, black gloves with metal backs engraved with the hidden leaf symbol, and the standard jounin vest. He looked over the 3 genin with a lazy eye and then spoke, "My first impression, well, you're quiet at least." With that blunt statement he ignored the confused faces of his audience. "Well, meet me on the roof in 10 minutes then." He told them this and then disappeared in a puff of smoke. The 3 genin got up and moved out the door, Shikamaru trailing a bit behind and still trying to wake up. Within the appointed 10 minutes the 3 were gathered on the roof, and facing their new sensei, though Shikamaru was still yawning a bit. Then Kakashi reached over to his breast pocket to withdraw his ever-present orange book. Nariko caught sight of the color of the cover and thought, well, doesn't that just figure, my first real shinobi sensei is a pervert. Before he even got a chance to open it though, Kakashi was suddenly blasted with an immense amount of killing intent. He might have been imagining it, but suddenly the world around him got darker and he slowly, instinctively, turned his head to look at his only female student. Nariko's hair threw a shadow over her eye and creepy balls of foxfire suddenly burst into existence on either side of her head. Then she began to speak in a sickeningly sweet voice laced with even more killer intent. "Kakashi-sensei, if you ever read that book in my presence I will burn it, and you, to ashes. Got it?" As she said the last her visible eye flashed red for a second, thoroughly unnerving the males around her. The jounin could only give a shaky nod of agreement before sliding his precious pawn safely back into its pocket. As soon as the book disappeared back into Kakashi's pocket the sun seemed to come back out and Nariko was all smiles again, though the hint of danger still lurked in her eyes when she glanced at Kakashi. Note to self, never piss off that girl, and never even attempt to read Icha in front of her, thought the jounin. After taking a few moments to gather himself, Kakashi decided to ignore what just happened for the moment. "Alright then, let's begin with some introductions," he said lazily. Shikamaru yawned again and asked, "Well, what do you want to know? How about your likes, dislikes, dreams for the future, hobbies, stuff like that?" He answered. "How about you go first, sensei?" asked Nariko. "Me? Well, I have no desire to tell you guys about my likes and dislikes. Dreams for the future? Well, I have lots of hobbies." The completely uninformative introduction just got him blank stares from his new subordinates. That didn't tell us a thing, was the prevalent thought. Now, it's your turn, on the left. He continued. Troublesome, said Genin, muttered under his breath before speaking up. Noro Shikamaru. I like things that aren't troublesome, and my best friend, Kyuubi. I dislike boiled eggs. My dream is to marry a regular girl who isn't too ugly and not too pretty, have 2 children, first a girl, and then a boy, retire after my daughter is married and my son becomes a successful ninja, and spend the rest of my life playing shogi or go. Then die of old age before my wife. My hobbies: cloud watching and playing shogi or go, I guess. He drawled all this out in a monotone that just about oozed laziness. Well, that was detailed, thought Kakashi with a slow blink before turning to the brunette Ucha in the center. You, the broody one, you're next, said Ucha, scowled at the description before apparently deciding to ignore it and begin his introduction. My name is Ucha Sasuke. I don't like much of anything. He swiftly glanced in Nariko's direction before continuing, there are tons of things I dislike though, including my hordes of fangirls. And I don't want to use the word dreams, but I have an ambition. The resurrection of my clan and to kill a certain man. Hobbies: training, I guess. There was a bit of an awkward silence for a moment as the other 3 stared at him for a while. I thought so, was Kakashi's thought. Then he cleared his throat and pointed at the only female of the group. All right, Blondie, it's your turn, he said. Blondie? She muttered, before commencing her own introduction. I'm Uzumaki Nariko, I like sleeping and ramen. I dislike how long it takes for ramen to cook, fanboys, and the majority of the civilian population of this village. At the last she got similar stares as Sasuke had gotten when voicing his ambition. My dream: I will become Hokage. This pronouncement was said with an unshakable certainty that surprised the 3 males. And this village will acknowledge me. The seriousness with which she said this left no doubt that she would find a way to do it. My hobbies are playing pranks and music. She finished with an amused smile at their reactions. She's grown up in an interesting way, thought the Jounin. Well, that's enough of that. We will start our duties tomorrow. What kind of duties? Asked Sasuke suspiciously. First, we are going to do something with just the 4 of us, he said seriously. What? Sasuke replied again with an irritated air. Survival training. Survival training? Asked Shikamaru with an exasperated air. Didn't we do enough of that at the academy? I will be your opponent and this won't be normal training. Then what is it? Nariko probed. Kakashi just chuckled a bit. Getting a bad feeling about this, Shikamaru spoke up again. Why are you laughing, sensei? No, well, it's just that when I tell you this you're going to flip. Flip? Kakashi leaned forward with a serious glint in his eye. Of the 27 graduates, only 9 will become genin. This is a super difficult exam with a failure rate of 66%. Shikamaru just stared at him with a shocked look as Sasuke frowned seriously over his folded hands. Nariko just looked at him blankly. She already knew that there would be a second exam, but she didn't know what it would be, so she was still a bit nervous. Kakashi smirked. Ha ha, I told you you'd flip. Then what was the point of graduating? Asked Shikamaru, wanting to know why he had to do this. Oh? That was just to weed out the hopeless cases. The 27 that graduated are just those that have the potential to become genin. Shikamaru nodded in understanding and Sasuke just frowned even more. Anyway, Kakashi continued, your performance will be graded at the training field. Bring all of your ninja tools and I suggest you not eat breakfast. You'll just throw it up. He then handed them all a printout with the details and left in a puff of white smoke. As he looked over the details, which just consisted of the place and time for the test, Shikamaru had just one thing to say, this is going to be troublesome, though they didn't say, so the others couldn't help but agree. It would be great to be a cloud, thought Shikamaru, not for the first time, just drifting along wherever the breeze takes you. As he watched the sun set and streaks of darkness etch themselves across the sky, Shikamaru filled his never-still mind with the peacefulness of the sky. This was why he loved cloud watching. The softly drifting and ever-changing clouds filled his mind with a peacefulness he found it difficult to find anywhere else, his thoughts drifting in and out of his consciousness like the clouds he so desired to resemble. Whenever he was awake he just couldn't stop thinking, analyzing what surrounded him without pause. For once he'd find it nice to be able to admire a pretty flower without counting every petal and thorn, taking note of every imperfection almost automatically and disturbing any appreciation for what beauty it might have had. The thing he disliked most about himself was that he did it with the people and situations around him as well. It was part of what made him so good at games like shogi. He guessed, it wasn't just that he could plan out his moves 200 places beyond where the game was now, it was also that he immediately sighted and focused in on any weakening or shift in a player's guard. The kind of strategy games he liked the most were just as much a battle of minds and personalities as they were that of wooden board pieces. He supposed that once he had more experience it would help make him a good ninja, but more often than not he found little point in striving after things just out of reach when he was fine with watching the clouds blow by. Striving for something just out of reach, hey, he thought. That girl, when she said that about becoming Hokage, she wasn't boasting. She was entirely serious. I wonder what could possibly have pushed her resolve so far? He let out an exasperated gust of air and sat up, his head still tilted towards the sky. He supposed that if he stayed on the team and passed that troublesome test he'd have a chance to find out. How troublesome, it seemed he'd have to find some way to pass it. After all, Uzumaki Nariko's resolve wasn't the only interesting part of his new team. Unanswered questions about his fellow genin and new sensei began to buzz furiously around his head, giving the familiar feeling of an impending headache. Blanking his mind of all thought again, he continued to stare upwards as the stars began to come out and the sun finally sank behind the trees that skirted his village. As the grey twilight of dusk finally set in, he rose from his position on the grass and, tucking his hands into his pockets, slouched and strolled in the direction of his clan's compound. He supposed his mom would have something to say about him being late anyway, so there was no reason to be in much of a hurry. He sighed again at the last thought. How troublesome. It was much later that same night when Uchiha Sasuke arrived at his house. After the three genin had split up, which was a few minutes after Kakashi had left, he had headed right to the training ground he had just about claimed as his over the years since the massacre. Only a quarter of a mile away from the Uchiha compound, it was in easy walking distance and suited his needs to the letter. Containing a large lake to practice his fire techniques on, as well as a flat area perfect for taijutsu practice, it was still just different enough from the lakefront his father had taught him the Gokaku no Jutsu, great fireball technique, at that it failed to stir any precious, though distracting, memories. Opening the door to his house he reflected on his day. Though he would never admit it out loud, he had been terribly excited as he walked to school for the last time. After all, today was the day he became a genin. One step closer in his chase after his elder brother. As it always did though, both then and now as he reflects on it, the mere thought of his clan's executioner soured his mood. That damn Itachi, shaking his head as if to exorcise any memory of the man from his mind, he didn't even need to turn around to lock the familiar door behind him. Then he toed of his ninja sandals, replacing them with soft house slippers, and called out softly down the empty hall, "I'm home." As per usual he received no answer. Not that he was expecting one, of course, but his jaw tightened with the conflicting emotions. As he turned into the kitchen he almost expected to see his now long dead mother turn from the stove to ask him how his day was. He frowned sadly at the cold and empty stove before turning to the fridge, opening it, and pulling out the kind of packaged bento you could find at any convenience store from a stack of many more. Still frowning, he stared at the wrapped box for a moment before tearing it open and sitting down to eat, not because he was especially hungry, but because even if he couldn't eat breakfast tomorrow morning he would still need all his strength. As he ate he turned back to his previous reflections. Much to his disappointment, souring his mood even further, the day started out as if it were any other school day. The only difference, if you could call it that, was that his classmates seemed even more hyper than usual in their excitement at finally graduating. The only exceptions to this were the ever-stoic Aburame in the corner and the Akimichi and Noro duo. Chuji was eating what seemed to be multiple bags of chips and Shikamaru was simply lazing in his seat, looking as if he wanted to fall asleep. Annoying nuisances that they were, what fangirls he had that were actually able to pass the final exam seemed even more determined to win his affections than usual. As if I were something that could be won like a prize, he thought for what felt like the millionth time with annoyance. He had been relieved when Iruka-sensei had used the demon head jutsu, sending his admirers flying back to their seats. The speech had been a good one, he supposed, but he hadn't really been paying much attention, waiting for the teams to be announced. He had really hoped that none of his fangirls would be placed on the same team as him. He had also been relieved to find out that Shikamaru would be the other male on his team. He would have hated to deal with someone as exuberant as Kiba on a daily basis. He paused in his eating and frowned at himself as he thought of the sole female of his team, as well as his reaction to her. She was beautiful, he could readily admit that to himself without compromising his pride, and she was clearly a serious kunoichi if the way she had scolded the pink banshee and the rest of the cheerleading squad was any indication. Her actions though, and what he had learned of her personality confused him. When Iruka had first introduced her, it had almost seemed as if she was flirting with the man. When Sakura had yelled at her, though, she had then suddenly turned into a highly skilled kunoichi, one clearly insulted by what the Pinkette and her cohorts were insinuating. Then she had just as suddenly reverted to her flirty and smiling ways, strolling up the steps to sit near him, and giving him a winking greeting. She also seemed to have an underlying sadness and emptiness that was all the more confusing for resembling his own. She had disappeared when the break had started, and after she returned she had almost immediately joined the lazy Shikamaru in sleep, before he was even able to figure out what he might want to say to her. He was slightly ashamed of himself for staring at her as she slept, it making him feel a bit like a stalker, but couldn't deny that he had. Getting a closer look at her, her seemingly elaborate costume was simply a layered yukata made of a strong material he couldn't identify. The hairpin seemed to be disguised senbon, and he couldn't help but be curious about her mask. He wondered why she wore it and if it had anything to do with what she mentioned when she introduced herself. Now that he thought more on it, her intro was almost as cryptic as his own. Sure, she had given out a few details that seemed to be true, but the majority of the civilian population of this village, he wondered what she meant by that. She hadn't seemed completely serious when she said it, she had treated the declaration as she was simply stating a food she disliked, but that almost made it even more intriguing. But, almost in contrast, when she had seriously declared that she would become Hokage, he was surprised, more than he felt he should have been. He had remembered her killing intent from earlier, and shuddered as well. He hadn't felt anything even remotely close to that since that night. Now that he thought on it, he wondered why she'd gotten so upset over a book anyway, but it doesn't really matter. If that intent was any indication of her true skill level, she must be quite strong. Even Kakashi-sensei had backed down. It made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, she may actually do it. Become Hokage, that is. Shaking his head to rid it of his thoughts on the girl, he got up and made his way to the sink to rinse out the bento box before stacking it with a pile of others on the counter. Turning his attention to the last part of what his new sensei had said, he frowned and tightened his jaw, this time with determination. He wouldn't become a failure, one that couldn't even pass his sensei's first test. He would become a genin. He was an Avenger, and he must get stronger. If he had to pass this stupid test to do it, he would. His resolve would not bend, would not break, and he would have his revenge. And maybe along the way he could learn more about the mysterious girl who was to be his teammate as well. As she stared out across her moonlit forest from the greenhouse in the top of her tower, Nariko frowned in thought. A 66% failure rate, huh? She muttered to herself and then shifted her weight on the cushion she had sat on, taking a small sip of tea as she did so. Yes, I wonder what it is myself, was the reply she got from her tenant. Arisa Kae-san, the girl blinked in surprise at getting a response at all. Arisa rarely spoke to her during the day, preferring to give observations when they spoke face to face at night in the mindscape. This was the second time today as well. The kitsune ignored the surprise she felt from her kit and continued, I wonder what the trick to the test is, she said. What do you mean by that, Arisa Kae-san? Nariko asked. Well, if so many people face this test and fail, there must be some sort of trick to it. Tomorrow, be sure to listen to and watch your sensei carefully. Despite his uncaring attitude, your sensei will at least give you guys a chance to beat whatever test he gives you. The kitsune finished. Nariko nodded in agreement with her mentor's wisdom, but remained silent. Taking note of her kit's agreement, Arisa retreated back to the mindscape, intending to follow her kit's example in having a cup of tea. Smiling a bit at her adoptive mother's intentions, the girl then turned her thoughts back to her team. Sasuke seemed to be a bit of a prick, but she'd worked with pricks before. She admittedly hadn't been on a team with any of the Uchiha, as the clan had been practically eradicated almost 2 years before she'd graduated, but a few of the Hyuga she'd had to tolerate had been much worse than the dark-haired boy seemed to be. Shikamaru was interesting though, and apparently shared her preference for sleeping. The only problem she might have with the boy was his sheer lack of ambition. Kakashi, though he was clearly at least a slight pervert and had no shame to speak of if his intention to read that book in front of her was any indication. She also knew he was extremely skilled though, and he could clearly teach them all a lot if he put his mind to it. She'd have to make sure the entire team impressed him enough to go straight to training tomorrow. She refused to believe that she wouldn't pass this test, and she'd make sure her teammates passed as well. That's what Nakama were for after all, and now that they would fight alongside her, that's exactly what they were. Just as the sun rose over the trees, 3 genin arrived at Training Ground 7. After an hour of waiting, the genin that were still awake began to inwardly curse the man who was to be their sensei. Shikamaru would have joined them, but he had gone back to sleep after waiting for 15 minutes. It was soon after this that Sasuke's stomach began to make soft rumbling movements, indicating how hungry he was. Hearing the soft sounds of hunger, Naruto turned from her contemplation of how she was going to brutally murder her sensei to stare at the boy in surprise. "Didn't you eat something before you left, Sasuke-san?" she asked. He frowned at her and curtly replied in the negative. "No." "Oh." She looked at him carefully for a moment before pulling an apple from the sleeve of her yukata, which was a soft green today. "You want an apple then?" she asked. He stared at it for an endless moment before turning his head away and refusing. "No." Seeing her slightly disappointed face, he quickly revised the blunt statement, "But thanks," he said in a low voice, and then wondered why he'd said anything else at all. She gave him a small smile and replied, "Don't worry about it. It's still there if you want it though." They were still waiting another hour and a half later. Feeling his stomach grumble yet again, Sasuke finally turned to Naruto and asked, "Is that offer on the apple still open?" With a stiff expression that said he wasn't used to asking for things. Naruto stared at him for a moment in surprise before reaching back into her sleeve. "Yeah, sure." She pulled out 4 apples this time and threw half of them to her teammate before turning to chuck another at Shikamaru. As the fruit conked the sleeping boy on the head, Sasuke caught his own apples and bit into one with a soft crunch. Shikamaru slowly sat up, rubbing his forehead where the apple had bounced off it, and reached over to pick up the now slightly bruised fruit. "What did you throw that at me for?" he asked with a lazy, half-hearted glare. He stared at the apple for a second and before Naruto could reply bit into it and leaned back on the training post he had been sleeping near. Raising her visible eyebrow slightly at the brunette's actions, Naruto replied, "Because if yesterday was any indication, he should be here soon." Shikamaru glanced up at the sky to judge the time and decided that she was probably right. He wasn't going to thank her for throwing an apple at him though. After the 3 had finished their apples and chucked away the cores, they waited for a few more minutes before Kakashi appeared and made his way towards them. "Hey guys. Good morning," he said a bit too cheerfully and gave a nonchalant wave. "You're late," was the simultaneous and growled response of Naruto and Sasuke. Shikamaru just yawned again. Kakashi ignored them both and moved over to the 3 training posts lined up nearby. As the 3 genin watched with slight confusion, he set up what looked like a very loud alarm clock on the one in the middle and then turned to speak. "Okay," he said, "it's set to noon." He then held up 2 bells in plain sight in front of him. "Here are 2 bells," he continued seriously. "Your task is to take these from me before noon. Those who cannot get a bell by noon get no lunch. Then I'll not only tie you to one of these stumps, I'll eat right in front of you." All 3 of them gave an internal sigh of relief at this. Shikamaru's mother had forced him to eat something before he'd been able to leave, and Naruto had completely forgotten about his suggestion and made herself a large breakfast before she left. Sasuke, on the other hand, was very grateful Naruto had decided to bring some apples along. Kakashi was a bit surprised that none of them looked very worried about that stipulation. Well, the next one will get some sort of reaction out of them either way, he thought before continuing to list the rules of the test. You only need to get 1 bell, but as you can see, there are only 2, so one of you will definitely be tied to a post. And the person who doesn't get a bell fails. So, at least one of you will be sent back to the academy. They all gave a nervous frown at that. "You can even use your kunai and shuriken, but you won't succeed unless you come at me with the intent to kill," he said seriously. At that their frowns became more serious and they quickly moved into ready positions. "Well, it seems like you're ready." He gave a soft laugh. They couldn't see his face, but they could almost hear the smirk in his voice when he said, "I think I'm beginning to like you guys." They just kept their eyes on him as he said, "Okay, let's get going. Ready? Start." All 4 of them disappeared in a swift blur of movement. Kakashi reappeared closer to the river that wound through the 7th training ground. "The ultimate basic of a ninja is to be able to hide yourself well," he said softly and scratched the back of his head as he looked around. Good, they've all hidden well, he thought, and then concentrated. Their chakra signals are all still quite apparent though. Sasuke's in that tree and Shikamaru is in the shadows over there. He then blinked in surprise. Wait, where'd Naruto go? Suddenly he felt his instinct screaming at him to duck and was quite grateful he had when Naruto's leg swung swiftly into sight, cutting harshly into the air where the back of his neck had just been. Naruto herself hadn't expected her first attack to land at all and swiftly turned in mid-air, her other leg dropping down in a devastating axe kick charged with large amounts of earth chakra, the words, Daichi Oyur, Gekiha. First quake, crushing, echoing through her mind. Kakashi's eye widened in surprise, and the speed of the kick, and as it seemed to make contact with him, a large booming sound echoed through the clearing as a dust cloud sounded the two combatants. Nariko glanced down at the wooden log her weighted heels had crushed beyond recognition before glancing up the side of the large crater she had made in the direction of her sensei's chakra signal. Kakashi had reappeared a small distance away from the dust cloud, completely unharmed but slightly shaken at the destruction the small genin had wrought. She's like a mini Tsunade. If that kick had been any faster, his eye then widened again as he was broken out of his thoughts by Nariko flying out of the settling dust with a fist drawn back for what was sure to be a devastating punch. She was too fast, and he too close, for him to use anything but the Kawarimi to dodge. She stared in slight shock as her chakra-enhanced fist connected with yet another log, sending it flying out over the river. Her eye then widened as she heard her sensei's voice from behind her. "You shouldn't let your opponent get behind you, you know," he said, and brought his hand down to chop across the back of her neck, intending to knock her out so he could deal with her after he'd finished testing the other two. Nariko, though, similarly to what her sensei had done less than a minute ago, dropped into a crouch to dodge the attack from behind. She then immediately attacked again with a low spinning kick aimed at Kakashi's knees. Kakashi, immediately seeing her intention, jumped into a swift back handspring to dodge. As he landed on his feet and stood to face her, she did the same. He said contemplatively, "You're much more skilled than any genin should be." He frowned at her, wondering who had taught her that taijutsu style, as it wasn't one he had ever seen used around Konoha before. It seemed to use quite a few different movements he could recognize straight off the bat, and quite a few he couldn't. His new student's movements were also very hard to predict, and it was probably only exacerbated by what he knew was a Quicksilver personality. She also seemed to use a strength-enhancing technique much like Tsunade-sama's. His contemplation of her skill level was interrupted by her reply. "Am I really?" she asked with a small, almost unnoticeable, smirk. "That's quite a compliment coming from a jounin of your caliber." She then abandoned any chatter and swiftly moved forward to attack again, pulling a kunai from her sleeve as she did so. This time Kakashi met her halfway, and they clashed with the sharp sound of metal hitting metal. The two other genin, who had almost been forgotten by the two combating members of the team, could only stare with a mixture shock and awe at the battle taking place before them. They found it very hard to believe their eyes. This girl, who couldn't be any older than themselves, was going toe-to-toe with their new sensei, a jounin. What shocked them the most, though, was that even though it was apparent that the elder ninja was holding back, Nariko seemed to not be going all out either. Though they didn't know it, they both had almost the same thought racing through their minds. Just who is Uzumaki Nariko? And how can she be this strong? As the two fighting ninja clashed once more, Nariko fed more chakra to her arm and pushed it all out with a single movement that crashed her kunai against her new sensei's. Both weapons immediately shattered under the sheer force of the blow, and Nariko, being the only one to have any warning, quickly secured herself against the ground with her chakra as Kakashi was sent flying to the crater she had created with that first mighty attack. He managed to land roughly in the center of the crater, somehow contriving to stay on upright as well, but still in slight shock from the sheer force of the blow. Bracing a hand against the ground to push himself up to his feet again, he was surprised when he suddenly heard two puffs of smoke and was then immediately secured against any further movement by two delicately strong pairs of hands. "You really shouldn't let your opponent get behind you, you know." The two female voices echoed from behind him. A solid bunshin, he thought incredulously, shocked at hearing his own words said back to him, before his attention was diverted by someone landing softly in front of him. She leaned down to delicately remove a single bell from his waist, and then she immediately moved back to the edge of the crater. "When did you?" he asked with slight surprise, indicating the clones with a nod of his head. "In the dust cloud after that first attack," was the reply. She then decided to explain a bit more. "I had them henge into a couple of pebbles. Then, when I saw the chance, I pushed you back in here, where they immediately immobilized you, as ordered." He gave a nod of understanding at the explanation. "I see," he replied, but kept on his eye on her. "It was a good spar, Kakashi-sensei," she then said abruptly. "Next time, we shouldn't hold back so much." She then disappeared in a swirl of leaves, and the bunshin dispersed soon after. Hold back, he thought as he stood up again and moved from the crater. And next time? He had of course been holding back quite a bit. He would never go all out on a genin team, but to think that she had been too, although, now that he thought on it, all he had gleaned about her during the short fight was that she knew the shadow clone jutsu, had some sort of strength-enhancing technique, and part of her taijutsu style. "She's damn good," he had to admit. He couldn't help but wonder how skilled she was when going all out, though perhaps he needed to train more. Sasuke watched the end of the fight with wide eyes. After Naruto disappeared, he frowned and, hardening his resolve, drew a few shuriken from his pouch and waited for an opening. He watched carefully as the Jounin jumped from the crater and turned away from where he was hiding in the trees, clearly deep in thought. Now, he thought with a slight thrill as he threw the shuriken expertly. They quickly spun out of the branches of the tree he was hiding in to slam into his sensei with a gushing of blood. He paused for a moment, then, slightly shocked that the shuriken had actually managed to land a direct hit on the Jounin. He then cursed to himself as the bloody man suddenly morphed into a log. Damn! That just gave away my position, he thought, and then quickly began to move to a different point to ambush the Jounin sensei at. So, his there was the only thought of the cycloptic Jounin that quickly moved to follow him. Shikamaru had carefully watched all of these events unfold with a calculating glint in his eye. Though Naruto was obviously even more skilled than he'd thought she'd be, and Sasuke was clearly about to get his ass kicked, he was more concerned with the test as a whole. There was something off about the whole thing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him. So, came a female voice from behind him. Do you think there's something very wrong with this test too? Naruto asked. Surprised at being so easily sneaked up on, he stiffened in slight shock before relaxing at her words and standing and turning to face the girl behind him. Yeah. I'm not sure what though, he said ponderingly. I wasn't either, was the reply. Wasn't, he thought with surprise before raising an eyebrow at his female teammate. The girl, catching the expression even in the dim lighting, quickly continued. I eventually decided to go along with the original instructions, she said, indicating the crater still readily apparent in the clearing with a slight tilt of her head. But I first knew there was something off with it all when he said that one of us would fail, regardless of what we did. After all, what would be the point of splitting us into 3-man teams if they were just going to split us up again immediately after? Shikamaru nodded in agreement, beginning to follow her train of thought himself. He almost continued for her, so, there must be something else to the test, something not readily available in the initial explanation. Yes, that's why I immediately attacked Kakashi-sensei, just in case it was something we could take at face value. She then paused for a second as she remembered the fight before continuing, but even after I secured the bell, Sensei didn't say anything to indicate that I had passed, he just asked about the tactics I had utilized. Obviously, there was something I was missing. Something you were missing? He repeated, and then his eyes widened in realization as he turned to the kunoichi. You don't mean? Well, from what I can remember, they always did place a lot of emphasis on teamwork at the academy, and it's the only thing I can think of. She replied, amused by the boy's reaction. Okay, he said with a nod, we'll do it together then. But how are we going to convince Sasuke to go along with it? I have an idea about that, she said as she glanced towards the sounds of the skirmish between Kakashi and Sasuke. Sasuke fumed quietly to himself as he was left neck-deep in the earth by Kakashi. As he attempted to wriggle his way out of his predicament, he frowned in frustration. What the hell had he done wrong? Things had seemed to go pretty well at first, the traps had worked as intended, and he had even managed to brush one of the bells with his finger. That was when everything had gone to hell, now that he thought more on it. Kakashi had quickly thrown him away as soon as he heard the bells at his waist jingle. Then, frustrated, he had blown a Gokaku no Jutsu at the Jounin. When the smoke had cleared, Kakashi had disappeared. Knowing better than to assume that the man had been burned to ashes, he had looked around to try and find where he'd gone to when he'd suddenly heard the former Anbu's voice echo from all around him. It's below. Before he'd been able to form a coherent thought in response, Kakashi had pulled him beneath the earth with a soft shout of, Doton, Shinju Zanshu no Jutsu. Double suicide decapitation technique. He'd been left with only his head above the ground, unable to do anything but scowl at the Jounin's back as he'd walked away, muttering something about Icha, whatever that was. It was humiliating. And just after that, Naruto had been able to fight just about on par with their sensei as well. He paused in his so far fruitless struggles as he considered that. If Naruto was able to do that, does that mean that she's just as far out of his reach as Kakashi was? And if that were really the case, just how far out of his league was Itachi still? Damn it! He was brought out of his thoughts by 2 pairs of feet landing on the ground in front of him almost simultaneously. Looking up as far as he could in this state, he could only make out 2 shadowed figures, even though he knew who they probably were. Then he almost winced at the sound of the female's voice, especially considering his recent thoughts. It looks like you might need some assistance, Sasuke-san. Asterisk, his own reaction to the wink still annoyed him though. Asterisk, hammer space is a wonderful thing, even if it's only a drastically modified storage seal inscribed on your forearm. Today's Jutsu, Kaiten, Gokakyu no Jutsu, Fire Release, Great Fireball Technique. In this technique, chakra is needed inside of the body and then converted into fire and expelled from the mouth in a massive orb of roaring flame. The scope of the attack can be altered by controlling the volume of chakra that is mustered to use it. The released flames should engulf their target and leave a crater on the ground surface. The fireball is normally blown through a ring made by the thumb and index finger of the user. The Kaiten, Gokakyu no Jutsu was, supposedly, originally created by the Uchiha clan, soon becoming one of their favorite moves, one with which they had become very adept. The Uchiha clan also used the Kaiten, Gokakyu no Jutsu as a sort of coming-of-age technique. The technique apparently requires more than average chakra reserves, and any regular genin should be unable to use this technique. Doten Ishinju Zanshu no Jutsu, Earth Release, Double Suicide Decapitation Technique. This is a ninjutsu where the user conceals themselves underground and then drags the target of their attack down into the earth, robbing them of their freedom. In addition, they can use this to start another attack. This technique was originally used for capture, then torture and interrogation, by first securing the prisoner and then, ever so slowly, cutting into their neck. Daiichi Oyu, Gekiha, First Quake, Crushing, made by Nariko as her first real earth-natured technique. It is currently unique to her and utilizes no hand seals, simply pure earth chakra manipulation. Created to compensate for Nariko's lesser strength when compared to the adults and older children around her, it is one of the only purely supplementary jutsu she frequently uses in direct combat. By infusing her limbs with potent earth chakra and releasing it on contact with her target, she gains immense physical strength. Inspired by the super strength technique of Tsunade of the Sannin, Arisa, the, now former, Kyuubi, believes that it actually has the potential to go beyond even that to, with enough control, induce minor earthquakes with a mere touch. The strength of the technique depends on a multitude of factors, including, but not limited to, chakra control and true physical strength. Though this technique apparently has the potential to kill with a flick of a finger, Nariko rarely uses it in such a way and only uses it to charge her muscles with enough force to match that of a minor Koge. A high B to mid S rank technique, depending on usage. In this chapter, as you can clearly see, we only got to see the tip of the iceberg.